Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We do a roll call.
Chow. Here. Tanya Booty. Here. Cohen. Here. Mendoza. Here. Hilpern.
Here.
Hernandez.
Here.
Cartha.
Here. Joey, can you do the approval for the meeting agenda?
I move that the board approve tonight's meeting agenda as presented.
Second. Chow. Yes. Tanya Booty.
Yes.
Cohen. Yes. Mendoza.
Yes.
Hilpern.
Yes.
Hernandez.
Yes.
Cartha.
Yes. We will start the evening off with some comments from Dr. Ward.
I have a series of comments and recognitions as we start off, and I want to welcome community members who are here and who are watching on TV. I do want to point out that our projector is on the fritz, and this happened in the spirit of democracy when we hosted voting here in the boardroom last week. Our special cords and connections that are over on the other side of the room were disconnected and moved around, and recovery will happen, but not tonight. And so we will make sure that the materials that we are presenting will be posted on our web and move forward. We offer our apologies for those who are watching live, but we will for sure make sure that the information will be posted. I have the great honor of recognizing our school board members. District 65 joins communities across the state in thanking our school board members for their commitment to our students and our schools. November 15th of each year is designated as School Board Members Day in Illinois. District 65 board members, the colleagues who are sitting around the table, donate hundreds of hours over the course of the year without any form of compensation to ensure that the children of Evanston and Skokie receive the best possible education. So we want to take a moment and thank you for your service. We have a small gift for you for your service, and I want to offer a round of applause for our school board members. The second thing is that coming up this week or this weekend, our distinguished school board president, Suni Kartha, will be receiving a master board member program recognition at the November Illinois Association of School Board Fall Division Meeting. IASB, the Illinois Association of School Boards, recognizes board members through the Master Board Member Program for the time and effort they devote to IASB leadership activities and service to the public education community. And for Suni, congratulations to you.
Thank you.
And at that same conference coming up this weekend, several members of the boards from both District 65 and District 202 will present a session called The Boardroom, Making Racial Equity from Theory to Practice. Or excuse me, I'm sorry, The Boardroom, Moving Racial Equity from Theory to Practice. The session will focus on why racial equity in schools is critical to the achievement of all students and how board members seek to identify all forms of racial inequity in our schools. And so we look forward to hearing about that. Second set of comments, I want to, and actually it relates to the commentary that the board members are going to do at the weekend conference on equity. Over the last couple board meetings, we've had opportunities to really show where the equity agenda that the board and the administration have been moving on, where the rubber hits the road. And the last time we met, we talked about our Algebra 1 opportunities for students and some of the growth that we're seeing, and we also talked about summer learning. And today, I want to highlight a couple things, and later on we'll be talking about our emerging work on Black student success. And all of this is nested in the equity work that we as a district have been doing. That started with the development of an equity statement, followed by an equity policy. We've been working on culturally relevant pedagogy throughout the system. We have equity learning going on with our staff at all levels. We've been doing extensive work on school climate teams and really, really important work. We have new policy on discipline that we've been working on, new dress code, again, all under the flag of equity. And this all falls under the broader strategic plan of the district, which highlights high-quality teaching and learning, a thriving workforce, a safe and supportive environment, and family engagement. I set that up because I want to make two comments. One is to reflect and to thank the students of Haven Middle School, and these are 8th grade students who did a beautiful performance, and I hope people saw this, called Know Me, K-N-O-W, Me, last week. And this is one of the things that we encourage and then we get pushed on is how to activate student voice and how to really get student voice to be part of the narrative of the education that we're providing, which is the obvious, but it has to be done in a proactive way. I mean, so our drama teacher, who's and head of the department at Haven, and head of the department overall, Betsy Quinn, has been an active member of our school climate efforts for the several years that we've been implementing this, and worked really hard to access student voice. And so what this was what this is, and perhaps we'll figure out a way for them to hit the road and do some more performances. This was a play that takes place in the hearts and minds of the students in the cafeteria. And it's an original play that was written and produced by the 7th and 8th grade drama students at Haven. And it covered so many powerful things from the voice of our students, and I just commend them. They looked at issues around race. They looked at LGBTQAI rights and gender stereotypes. They looked at issues around body image. They talked with full voice about inner thoughts and feelings, about loneliness. They talked about the engagement that they have with each other, all within the setting of a school cafeteria. And so when the next time you walk into a middle school cafeteria and you see all that buzz, we also know that behind that are young children, young adults who are maturing and who are working through a wide range of issues in our community that is actually very, very important. So I just want to salute the students and their powerful, powerful voice, and Betsy and her colleagues at Haven for really presenting this. And again, maybe in a future meeting, we'll, however we can do it, maybe we can bring a few kids to act out or do something, because I think it's really important. That leads me to a final statement that also is really important for me to express as we think about our equity agenda and we think about the work that is going on in the district and incidences that occur in the district. So over the past week, Evanston and Skokie residents may have seen local news reports about hateful, racist, and sometimes violent language used by some students in District 65. While our commitment to racial and educational equity is widely known, I would like to take this opportunity to once again state that hate has no home and will never be welcome in District 65. Principal Max Weinberg of Lincolnwood Elementary recently wrote a fantastic letter to his community calling out specific incidences of outwardly racist comments towards black students at the school. I appreciate his candid use of language and ensuring that both staff and families heard that the words spoken by the students, words that dripped with both hate and hurt, were explicated for the community. This harmful language is not unique at Lincolnwood and has negatively impacted communities of color across our schools for too long. When these situations occur, it further distances students from feeling like a part of their school community. For this reason, we remain committed to our equity and our anti-racism efforts and to working to ensure that all students and staff members can feel welcome, cared for, and safe in our schools. Principal Weinberg, his fellow principals across the district, and all those committed to championing equity have my full support. We expect all educators, administrators, and support staff to intervene whenever situations occur that have the potential to cause physical or emotional harm. Our team continues to provide guidance and resources, which includes encouraging the use of tools from our Courageous Conversations trainings to navigate issues of race amongst our students and our staff. In addition, we remain committed to restorative justice practices through the use of peace and sharing circles. We encourage our students to speak their truth and not to make assumptions. We all have different lived experiences and come from different backgrounds. We look different. We identify with different races and ethnicities. We believe in different religions. We have different gender identities, and we have different cultural beliefs. Regardless of our differences, what matters most is that we treat one another with kindness, compassion, and respect. Anything less is not acceptable. We will maintain our commitment to equity learning, and we will work tirelessly to foster a sense of belonging for every member of our community. And again, these words also echo the voice from the powerful voice from the students, and especially as they talked about their own identities and their own racial identities, and how important it is to recognize who they are and the importance that we need to continually stress the support for all members of our community. That ends my comments.
Thank you. Any comments from any board members? Right, well, thank you very much for that statement, Dr. Gorin. And with that, we'll move on to one of my favorite parts of the meeting, the high five recognition.
And I too am excited to announce that the High Five Celebrating Excellence in District 65 Staff Recognition Program has returned for a second year. We look forward to recognizing a second cohort of employees for their tremendous work and their continued dedication to their students, colleagues, and District 65 families. Last school year, we launched the High Five program with the goal of publicly acknowledging the incredibly dedicated members of our team and to engage our community in the important work happening throughout our school district every day. We are grateful to First Bank and Trust, together with Byline Bank, for their continued support of the High Five program. Through their partnership, each of our recipients will receive a $75 Visa gift card, a framed recognition certificate, and an invite to a celebratory luncheon for all of the year's recipients to be held in May. Without further ado, I'd like to invite our November recipients to the podium. Ms. Risha Mae Bennett, Secretary at Lincoln Elementary, and Ms. Christy Kaplan, first grade teacher at Kingsley Elementary, and those that have joined us to share remarks on their behalf. Principal Michelle Cooney from Lincoln, and Ms. Katie Kopp from who's a District 65 parent. So if Ms. Bennett, Ms. Kaplan, Ms. Cooney, and Ms. Kopp can join us at the podium, we will start the presentations, and I will turn to Principal Cooney for the beginning of this.
I'd also like to welcome Addie to the podium with us, who's joined her mom. Miss Bennett was nominated by Lincoln parent Bridget Ragnerson, who could not be with us tonight. She offers her congratulations and asks that I share the following excerpt from her nomination. Miss Bennett is the first person that visitors meet when they enter Lincoln, and she presents the most wonderful welcome. She is funny, smart, thoughtful, kind, and calm in a crisis. She is exactly the person I would want to see if I ever had to arrive at Lincoln in a panic. She makes us feel heard, relevant, and safe. Miss Bennett is a delight to the students, too. My children adore her, and I understand why. We are a stronger school community with Miss Bennett helping to guide and lead with so much love. Congratulations.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's an honor because when you send your child to school for the day as a parent, you need a lot of trust. And to me, Ms. Kaplan has definitely earned that trust and gone above and beyond. I think to put into practice all the wonderful things you plan and we plan for our children, you need a dynamic link to bring all of those qualities to the children, and that's what she does. So bridging school and home, I think, is paramount, and it's not easy, and she makes the extra effort. So she teaches from an empathetic view, and she relates to the children as whole individuals, not just people there for learning. She considers their perspectives and their feelings, and the parents and families' perspectives and feelings, so there can be kind of a united front. And I think that helps make the children make a lot of progress. She takes on challenges with an open mind. I know my son, it can be challenging, I live with him, and she takes it on day in and day out, and shows up and shows the dedication to him and all the other children in the classroom. Everyone's important, and they feel important, and they know they're important. A few more things. There's so much to say, but something that always stands out is how organized her classroom is. She's ready for success, and when the children walk in, they know they fall into the routines, which is so comforting to them. She comes in early, she schedules meetings with parents, and provides support when needed, and has an open door policy, so we all feel welcome. So thank you from our family. Thank you from all the families that you've affected and will always affect. It's a big deal, and we all know that, and if you don't hear it every day, I hope you can pull it out of your pocket when it's a struggling moment. We all
We're about to come over and take some pictures, but I don't know if either of you want to say anything, and you don't have to feel obligated, but please come to the microphone.
I'm always prepared. First, I want to thank Katie Kopp for nominating me for this award. I was very surprised. I'm humbled by your kind words. I appreciate this recognition for my work with children in District 65. I've worked in Evanston since 2000. This means a lot to be chosen among outstanding teachers and staff. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to come over and do the honors of handing a certificate and taking a few pictures. If I may, I wanted to also close. One of the champions of this program was a gentleman by the name of Paul Kogel, who worked at First Bank and Trust, which is now a division of Byline. And with great sadness, we found out at the end of the summer he had passed away. And he was such a champion when we approached him and approached the bank to think about how do we recognize our great staff across the board. And he came to almost every one of the celebrations. He came to the luncheon, and he always, when he talked to me and he talked to others, he talked about at least one, if not both, of his children who are teachers, and how important it was. So I just want to celebrate the life and the memory of Mr. Kogel, who was really has his signature all over this program.
Thank you. Okay, well, with that, we will move on to public comments. Members of the public are welcome and invited to address the board during open public meetings. The Board of Education will not permit the voicing of personal attacks against any district employee or board member. Please remember to state your name and that you have 3 minutes to address the board. And our first speaker signed up is Kelsey Wicks.
Yes, please.
Just want to say hello to all of the board members and those in attendance. Just going to dive right into it because I only got 3 minutes. What I don't have time to discuss, I did a full presentation on a podcast about 2 weeks ago at the website Shine, like you shine your shoes, shine1, the numeral 1.us, shine1.us. Parents and guardians want to know who can help their children become successful. Okay. Shine was an endeavor, a global senior citizen endeavor that I started back in July of 2016 to see if we could connect senior citizens globally. senior citizens can really impact the way things are done in this world. We can really change things with a unified voice. We want to see if we can create new dimensions in communications between school, parent, guardian, students, community, and church. SHINE is an acronym that stands for Seniors Helping and Impacting Now, okay? Senior citizens are ambassadors of long life. That's evidence on its face just by our being here. We are ambassadors of life. At a time, we represent long life at a time when it appears that the value and the premium of life is diminishing. Thousand Oaks not too long ago, dastardly murders. Somebody went inside of a synagogue not too long ago and just killed people. So we have to try to break the cycle. Senior citizens can impact the career choices for our children. How? We are suggesting, proposing a National Senior Citizens Lecture Series whereby professionals, senior citizens, and you don't have to be a senior citizen, but if you're a professional, you have a trade, come in and share with us. If you're a doctor, lawyer, dentist, builder, architect, real estate agent, share with us the motivating factor of what drew you into your profession. What were the obstacles? What are the requirements? What are the disciplines? What are the rewards of your profession? Share with us, because right now on the west side of Chicago, I know where there are a group of boys every day, the same time, same place, in shifts, selling marijuana. So we have to employ interventions and support groups to help break this cycle. Case in point, when I was in high school, I don't have my presentation materials with me tonight, I forgot them, but if you look at my yearbook, you'll see Kelsey Wicks, favorite class, geometry, favorite teacher, Mr. Blewett, ambition, doctor, that is medical doctor. Did I become a medical doctor? No, I didn't even come close to it. Why? Maybe I didn't have the proper people resources. Maybe I didn't ask the right question. When I went to college, I really don't recall asking. If I did, I don't recall if they had a medical school. So for whatever reason, I didn't make it and I drifted. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to close that gap to make sure that students realize the aspirations that they that they start out with, that they show an interest in. One thing that we want to employ from that National Seniors Lecture Series, we want to have after the lecture, students who are drawn to that lecturer, we want them to fill out an intent of profession form.
Right.
It's
Thank
basically
you.
just a form.
Thank you, sir. Your 3 minutes are up, but thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Reverend Michael Neighbors.
Good evening. Superintendent Gorin, President and Vice President and board members, happy board day. Yeah, that's new. My wife and I have a middle child, Pierce, who told us this summer that there was such a thing as Middle Child Day. We celebrated that day with him, and so we celebrate School Board Day with you all tonight as well. I appreciate your comments, Superintendent Gorin, regarding the same issue that I am here to address this evening. On behalf of the NAACP and many in the African American community, I believe it is very important for us to publicly share our alarming concern regarding recent events that occurred at Lincolnwood Elementary School. As president of the branch, I have reached out to both Principal Weinberg and Superintendent Gorin to express, number one, my concern, and number two, to offer any assistance to immediately confront and stop this dangerous trend of pejorative and racist language. Racist and biased language at any age, in any situation, and spoken by anyone is reprehensible and unacceptable. Such words and actions are not to be tolerated, and we must be sure that they are met with swift and decisive discipline in order that they will not become a trend, will not become tolerated, and under no circumstances will go unchecked. We are living in very trying times. Hate and hate crimes are occurring and going unchecked throughout the nation and world. But we cannot allow that to happen in Evanston. It cannot be accepted. It cannot ever be accepted. For too long, minorities in our nation have fought for equal rights, for respect, and for equity. For too long, African Americans and other minorities have been mistreated, maligned, and talked about. This is horrible at any level, but it is especially horrible with elementary school children. And so we encourage District 65 to be a leader in bringing this episode to light as you have done, and also bringing it to an end. The NAACP pledges to work with Mr. Weinberg, who we have reached out to, the faculty and families of Lincolnwood, to hasten the day where we can truly ensure that we are all accepted and appreciated by our internal disposition rather than by our race or ethnicity. You all cannot solve this problem alone, and we cannot solve the problem alone. It is going to take the school, and it is going to take the community and all of the community to work together. So we want to make ourselves available and at your disposal, whatever path you choose to take. We want to also be on it and to participate in the plan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And our final speaker is Terry Shepard.
Good evening. My name's Terry Shepard, and I'll just start by saying ditto to everything that Dr. Neighbor said. I'll introduce myself as a past school board member, as a parent of 2 children that graduated from Oakton Elementary School, 1 from Lincoln. And I'll quote Yogi Bear when he says, "This is deja vu all over again." Because this language that has been discussed since it was first revealed by the principal of Lincolnwood School, this is not the first time. This has happened here many, many times from schools along the north and the northwest side of Evanston. And those comments are always directed toward children of color, and specifically African American children. I want to offer something a little different. I'd like to also say, Dr. Neighbors was right. We should have a dialogue on race here. We've talked about that for years, and nobody seems to have the courage to do it. So maybe this is the time. But I'd like to offer those parents of African American children on the north side an option. And that option is Oakton Elementary School. And I'd like to specifically suggest they enroll their children in the African-centered program at Oakton. It's a Magnets program, just like the TWE program. The ACC is a very nurturing program. We've got a dynamic new principal there, Dr. Allen. Dr. Allen begins his every morning, like all the other schools, with the Pledge of Allegiance. Then he has the pledge of the school. Then the African-centered kids do their pledge. And then he has a student from within the school come grab the mic, and they lead the whole school in a breathing exercise. And everybody prepares themselves for the day. They do this in the morning, and they do this after lunch. It quiets them. It gets them in the mood to be together, to understand what the rest of the day is to do. It's a very nurturing environment. And plus, I'm inviting everybody to review the test scores of African American students at Oakton School. Those kids are doing some great things down there under the leadership of the past principal, as well as, I'm positive, is going to continue under the leadership of Dr. Allen. So African American parents, don't give up. Look at the other option. Come to the South Side, where you'll be very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on with our agenda. Sergio, got the motion?
I move that the Board of Education accept the recommendations outlined in the attached group motion and approve the personnel appointments, leaves, and separations, track movement, October 2018 Board and Committee meeting minutes, destruction of September 2016 closed session audio recording, August 2018 list of bills, treasurer's report, and budget amendment, gift acceptance for Dewey.
Second.
Chow,
Yes.
Tanya Vudi,
Yes.
Cohen,
Yes.
Mendoza,
Yes.
Halpern,
Yes.
Hernandez.
Yes.
Cartha,
Yes. Move on to the approval of the FY18 financial audit. Candace?
Yes. I move that the Board of Education approve the FY18 financial audit as
Second.
presented.
Do we have a presentation on this? Or we discussed this at the Finance Committee meeting, so I don't know, did the team have any additional comments or presentation?
The audit for FY18 was presented at the last Finance Committee by John George. He's a partner with external auditing firm, and the district received unmodified and clean opinion for the operations of District 65 and Park School. There was no material findings or any deficiencies, and as soon as the audit is accepted, it will be sent to the state and to various state and federal institutions.
Thank you. Can we go ahead and take the vote?
Chow,
Yes.
Tanya Vudi,
Yes.
Cohen,
Yes.
Mendoza,
Yes.
Halpern,
Yes.
Hernandez.
Yes.
Cartha,
Yes. The adoption of the 2018 tax levy resolution. Anya?
I move that the Board of Education adopt the Truth in Taxation Resolution to estimate the taxes to be levied for the 2018 tax year.
Second.
Again, we discussed this at the Finance Committee meeting last week, so I don't know if we have anything to add to it, or if we can go ahead to move to the vote then.
Chow,
Yes.
Tanya Vudi,
Yes.
Cohen,
Yes.
Mendoza,
Yes.
Halpern,
Yes.
Hernandez.
Yes.
Cartha,
Yes. The approval of the summer learning plan. Lindsay?
I move that the Board of Education approve the summer learning plan presented.
Again, we discussed this at our working board meeting last week, so I assume that we don't have any additional updates or questions. So we can go ahead and move to the vote, please.
Chow,
Yes.
Tanya Vudi,
Yes.
Cohen,
Yes.
Mendoza,
Yes.
Halpern,
Yes.
Hernandez.
Yes.
Cartha,
Yes. With that, we will move on to the discussion items on our agenda, the first of which is the first quarter strategic plan progress report. So,
And I'll kick this off very briefly, and then each of my colleagues will comment. And I'll remind all of us to lean into the microphone so that people here and out in TV land can actually hear us. As we have done by practice, we make the strategic plan and a live document. And so we come back quarterly to report on the progress that we're making on our plan as we're moving forward and on the various initiatives that we have underway in the district. And so what you'll see here, and typically at the beginning of the year, you'll sometimes see green, yellow, on the rare occasion, the orange, but these are signals of the progress that we're making based on the commitments we made with the board and with the public as we planned for the year. And so we've got a couple areas where, again, in the kickoff of the school year, and also as we've had a few new staff members join us, we're in the yellow quadrant for a couple, but that's part of the process as we move forward during the year. So I'm going to just go around the table. I'll start with Stacy Beardsley, Dr. Beardsley, on high-quality teaching and learning, and we'll do a couple quick highlights, and then if you have questions, we'll be happy to take them.
okay, great.
So in high-quality teaching and learning, our strategic plan deliverables this quarter were largely focused on the design and delivery of professional learning and the execution of curriculum revisions. And so a couple key points. Over the summer into the fall, the Curriculum and Instruction Department, in partnership with school leaders and teachers, designed the Access to Innovate teacher training, which was focused on instructional technology and its integration into high-quality teaching and learning over the summer, which was targeted for middle school educators. It's 2.5 days, and a 2-day Institute on Culturally Responsive Pedagogy was also designed and implemented as part of our Institute days. Additionally, in the curriculum review lane, we did work over the summer we gathered input on actually through the remainder of the school year, gathered input on social studies, gathered input on our social, emotional, and equity learning, computer science courses, and our Advisory 2.0 course, and did curricular revisions on those courses this summer. The majority of those were new last year, but did the revisions with educators this summer, and those Advisory 2.0, SEAL, and computer science revisions are all in place this year.
Thank you. And then we move to Thriving Workforce.
So for the Thriving Workforce, for Q1, we really focused on our new teachers and making sure they were prepared to start their school year with us. We extended their new teacher orientation to 7 days, and we tried to give a balance so that they could participate in some very in-depth training, including 2 days of Beyond Diversity, as well as training on technology and curriculum, but also trying to give them an opportunity to get into their classroom and plan and set up and be ready. So that's where we focused our attention for Q1. The second piece of that is we are working towards selecting a new lead teacher mentor. This is a DEC position. It's a stipend position that provides a leadership opportunity for one of our veteran teachers to help facilitate the new teacher mentor meetings that also take place during the year. While that role, there's no one sitting in that particular position, our teachers are still getting support through Dr. Beardsley and Dr. Green, as well as some other licensed staff.
And Joyce will talk to us a bit about our work on safe and supportive school climates.
As Stacy mentioned, there's been some changes in terms of really developing our SEAL work, cell work, and Advisory 2.0 that we had groups working on during the summer. In addition, Andali and I worked on the student handbook, which we talked about at the policy committee, related to dress code and discipline policies, and implemented some changes that began at the school year. We discussed that at the policy committee in October and are continuing to work on that.
And Joaquin Stevenson, who's just come on board as our Director of Equity and Family and Community Engagement, is actually in a seed class tonight, so let me take his place for the time being. I think the most important progress that we've made in this domain is that all of our licensed staff in District 65 have had the opportunity and have taken the Beyond Diversity racial equity training as a first step towards our work, as I mentioned earlier, on equity and equity learning. We also, for this year, have recruited 160 participants for 7 seed cohorts seeking equity and educational diversity. And this is a scaffolded course over an 8 or 9 month period. And again, Mr. Stevenson is actually leading that as we speak. And we've engaged the Board of Education and our community members in the creation of gender administrative procedures that follow through on the policy that the board passed last year, so that we can work on that level of engagement as it relates to identity, which is again a larger part of our equity agenda. Financial sustainability?
We continue to work to come up with different ways of engaging our community in the transparency and the use of funding. And as part of that, in September, we held a 3 community budget meeting at 3 locations in order to give community members an opportunity to get a better understanding of the budget and also to ask questions. Additionally, we've posted the budget book as well as the budget at a glance information on the website, which can easily be accessed by community members and with an opportunity to have questions to reach out to the business office to provide answers to those questions.
So with that as highlights, if there are questions, and again, our intent, as always, is that the work of the district, which is guided by the strategic plan and includes absolutely our equity agenda, that the work of the district, these are the guideposts, the guide rails as we're taking the long journey. And so we are always happy to come back and report where we are and where we're going, and where we have bumps along the way, or challenges along the way.
Thank you. Questions or comments?
I just wanted to applaud Dr. Gorin and the entire team. I think it's wonderful when you set aggressive goals. It's honest to not always be in the green. And that's a decent thing as long as the goals you feel are aggressive yet attainable. Not everything's going to be a home run. And I think these quarterly reports, some are better, some are worse, depending on how you read the colors. But I think they always reflect a lot of really heavy lifting work that takes up a lot of time, that is real energy spent towards the strategic plan and the mission of the overall organization. And I just thank you for the honesty of bringing one forward continually, quarterly, that aren't always green, because it's not always roses. So thank you.
And indeed, we are a learning organization that stresses continuous improvement in every classroom, in every building, and in this building as well. So that's what you're seeing. Thank you. We appreciate that.
Candace?
Thank you as well. I'll echo what Joyce said. And I was just raised a question of, in terms of the training, we had talked about certified staff. I'm thinking specifically of, lunchroom staff, outdoor staff. At what point are they already, or will they be trained? And, also, as we're talking about our work in anti-racism, clearly a lot of things happen when kids are not necessarily in the classroom setting, and we need to make sure all of our teams are aligned to help us work on that. So just curious if you get an update there. It's not obviously reflected in this quarter.
I know that Joaquin Stevenson has a plan as far as who to prioritize for the Beyond Diversity trainings that are going to continue this year. And there are some representatives of those groups that have been trained already, and I know there are priorities of moving on into the other groups that are within his plan for training this year.
Okay.
And he just completed last week a mini training with our administrative assistants and secretaries. So it's that sort of engagement that we are enacting as we go forth this year.
It would be really good to engage those folks as well as we're trying to uncover what other things might be happening in spaces, to have an ear and eye for that. Because if it's not in the classroom, it may not be getting surfaced as quickly as we would like. So as part of the training.
Well, and that's especially the case as we think about the comments I made and the community members, Shepherd and Pastor Neighbors did, that we are all a community here. And so when we hear things, when we see students engage in the type of language that is rather violent, that we have to call it. And that includes the school secretary or the playground supervisor, and I think that then becomes part of what we, in a caring community, we're all caring, and we're also trying to help young people to develop those skills of how they interact really well. So I think it's an important push for us.
Any other questions?
That raises another question in my mind, which I'm not sure the strategic plan would be the place to collect this, but if there is any method of collecting data about when these instances occur, so that we have an idea of how often and where that is happening, which also may draw folks' attention to when it happens.
We can discuss,
So in our, currently, any racialized language, or, is that what you're speaking to specifically? Hateful language and racist?
Sense of racism.
Yeah, so it would, sorry?
Or exclusionary language that's meant to harm another child?
So it falls into two categories. There's a minor and a major category, and so.
I believe we lean into the microphone, please.
So the language is coded, so in our internal system that our staff would use to be able to look at trends around what you're asking. So our schools are asked to look at, on a monthly basis, what are the trends in terms of what kicks up or what behaviors are presenting themselves in order to be able to have a response as part of our PBIS system. So in cases where you're going to see this, it would be tracked in the system as either hateful or hurtful language that's used. And so it's something that can be pulled in terms of looking at it. We can look at if there's some questions more specifically about where we may have it happening.
And how are folks trained to identify and track that?
So in every school, you're talking about in terms of inputting the data or in terms of our PBIS process? So anything that is exclusionary or racialized or hurtful language, that's part of our, both in terms of building a inclusive and caring environment. There's two things happening. One is that, we have our Beyond Diversity work and our Courageous Conversation in terms of helping our staff begin to understand their own role in as individuals. We also have our school climate, both within the first 2 years or the first 2 steps. There's relationship building and then there's safety. So as Biz Ryan was here back in the spring, she spoke a little bit about the language of safety. And actually in the first, as a principal myself, when I went through it, you're looking at how are we talking about when there are incidences of racialized language in our schools, when people are using hateful terms. What is the shared language? How does the school understand that? And so part of what the school climate's responsibility is to begin to develop a plan to respond to that in each of our schools. And that's first layer is relationship building, then safety in terms of bullying. George, did you want to add anything?
Our safety piece has really developed through the school climate team in the last couple of years. The documentation, I think, of incidents that occur has to expand in all of the school climate teams in terms of us really understanding when and where things occur. We do have an extensive bullying system that we developed that principals are to respond to in terms of events that they hear of, documentation, investigations, following up with both sides of students that have offended and those who have been bullied or things have been said to them. So it's a broad piece that we have, but something I think we need to continue to look carefully at.
It sounds, if I'm understanding correctly, like we don't currently have anything systematic.
You gotta go into.
It sounds like we currently don't have anything systematic to track any instances of dehumanizing language being used, that perhaps it may fall under bullying, but it may not, and in that case, there's not.
I think,
Is that what I'm hearing?
I'm guessing that some of those incidents have occurred where we have given office discipline referrals, or there may have been restorative practices that have been provided to address that. I think specifically that's something we're going to have to take a closer look at, though.
Yeah, and I think if I'm hearing Anya correctly, and I would echo this, and we'll get to this when we talk about the discipline report, but we certainly have different categorizations of
Right.
ODRs that perhaps it's time to consider, given what we're hearing that we know that has been going on at our schools. It's not unique to one school or unique to this year, but maybe to be able to really analyze in a data-driven way what's happening in our schools in terms of racist language being used, that maybe we need to consider expanding the categories to include that as an ODR referral, so then we can have the data to figure out how and where we need to respond appropriately.
Yeah, I think that
I don't know. I mean,
we need to specifically call that out, and that's what we need to add.
I would say that to this point, a lot of our categories are broad, so they're not specific to highlighting the specific trend underneath it, they're broad categories. So hurtful bullying, if you look at our discipline data, in our discipline data, we use a category such as aggressive, threatening behavior, disrespectful, so some of these are broad umbrellas that would include a racialized language. I think it's a good point, and I think we're all in agreement that it would be something we could easily lift into our system of tracking.
So the question was inspired by conversations with Rebecca, which is why I was looking at Rebecca to see if she had anything to add. But I would say that my thought to initiate it around this conversation is that perhaps when folks think of disrespect, they may not be thinking, oh, I heard a racist conversation. That is a disrespectful infraction, and now I need to respond to it with these steps that I usually take if I see an aggressive or disrespectful behavior. And that perhaps even if folks are trained, but it's not called out to them to say, this is something that we care about and we want to track and we want to make sure it's not happening. These are some of the tools that you have in order to respond that perhaps folks may not. Because to be frank, in some of the stories that folks have shared with me, it's been indicated that some of these things have happened and they're in front of what we're supposed to be caring adults, and there hadn't been a response.
Right.
Which would indicate to me that perhaps folks don't know how to respond, and that perhaps they need to be supported in how to respond in these situations.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that we need to have the
You got to
right.
speak into the microphone, please.
I completely agree with you, and we need to have the right interventions to address this. So, yes.
And I want to support, so then, just to piggyback off that again, we have a great example of what happened in Lincolnwood. I mean, you had a principal there who was able to, reach out to the community in a loving way, and in a way that is responsive to, again, different folks' lived reality, but very targeted in regards to how we should address as a community racism and any incidences of it. So we have a template. So how do we operationalize something like that? And again, we're trying to do it through our school climate work. We're trying to do it through our equity training. So that's a start. But again, we really do need to, again, kind of wean from, folks like Max or Weinberg over at Lincolnwood. How do you operationalize that? Because there's a set of steps where he reached out to parents. And for me, that's a huge piece that we really need to develop this relationship with this really great homeschool connection in regards to move this equity work forward. So we're training our teachers. We have some parents who are coming to Courageous Conversations, which is great, right? But how do we continue building upon some of these, again, successes that we're seeing and really building on it to make sure that everybody gets it. Everybody, latches on to equity, and we have this honest and courageous conversation around race in this community. That again, as was shared earlier in public comment, that this is something that is not new. So.
I just wanted to add that I think sometimes in not calling something what it is, it gets lost, right? So you might say these incidents are happening at the school, but they're put under the label of bullying. And that's very different than a school having a bullying problem versus a school having racism problems. And so my request was just for us to document, like, how often is this happening at what schools, and what support can we lend the schools, because we're calling it what it is. We're not saying it's disrespectful behavior, it's bullying, it's an act of racism. And I think not just in schools, but if we looked at racism as a symptom that needs to be treated and it needs to be diagnosed, and I think that it's a little bit different. In terms of, yes, it has been happening in this district for a long time, and maybe because we've never called it out, it keeps resurfacing its face. But if we start giving it a name and saying how often it happens, then it gives us, and the community and us as an administration, a goal to work towards, similar to suspensions and similar to any other behavior that we want to ultimately say there is no space for that here.
And indeed, we worked very closely with Mr. Weinberg and with all of our other principals, and to give them full support to be able to not only call it out, but to know that the administrative team at the central office stands behind them with our full support.
I just think, to add on to what everyone said already, I want to make sure that we as a board stay in our lane too. So leveraging my Beyond Diversity training, everything here is about highlighting race as an important element that we want to be able to address directly. So as a board, we have adopted an equity statement highlighting race as an instrumental part of everything that we need to be looking at. As a board, we have invested in Beyond Diversity training and C training for our faculty. As a board, we've approved the vision for and the investment in a Director of Black Student Success, and addressed a number of policy areas that all have race as a factor. The discipline report that has the broad categories doesn't have race explicitly listed. It sounds like that's something that the board would like to see in a future report addressed somehow, that the team needs to figure out how that fits in. Because when a child is talking on a playground, they can sound and look very peaceful and respectful while using hateful and racist language. And that doesn't always look like something to report to an 8-year-old or a 6-year-old, right? So how do we fit that into the system is something for the team to look at and do, but I think it sounds like it's something we want to highlight, because that's what all this work is about.
I appreciate that. I appreciate isolating race, and I definitely would agree that I think it's important to isolate race in our reporting. It was not present, and so when I was speaking about school climate team work, it was specifically to say isolating race is the number one first thing we talked about when it came to looking at incidences of bullying in our school. What's the root of it? It's about isolation that's race-related. It's about race that's issues that are related to culture and otherness. And so there's a layer of that. And so absolutely, I think initially, in terms of our reporting structure, it's interesting because we've lifted a number of priorities and kept what we would argue are the broad ones, but we haven't isolated race. So I appreciate the attention to that. So we'll definitely look at that and make an update.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments about the strategic plan Q1 progress report? Okay, well, thank you very much, team. As usual, it represents, like Joey mentioned, a significant lift in the work that's being done. So thank you for the report on it. With that, we'll move to our second discussion item, our school improvement process for Black student success. And it looks like we might actually also have the presentation working. Oh, excellent.
So let's highlight the importance of city-school collaboration, because Anderson, was working diligently as we were talking, who's our colleague from the city of Evanston who helps us on the production, has connected us back to the technological age, so I'm just pleased. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. LaTarsha Green and have her come forward as we give a snapshot on the work that we are committed to do around and focused on Black student success. These were deliberations that we had as a board and an administration, and both creating the position and moving forward. We had actually thought about doing this update several months from now. And actually in speaking together and then with the board, we thought it was actually as important, if not more, to give an early snapshot of the work that we have underway. And so what Dr. Green's going to do tonight is to give a sense of the important journey that she is taking in our schools as we focus on Black student achievement and indeed the work that she's doing with all of us as a team as we work together as a team on these important issues. So LaTarsha, jump right in, please.
Good evening, Board of Ed and all constituents. Tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work, as Dr. Gorin mentioned, related to some school improvement processes that we're undertaking. The objectives for tonight is really to just share a little bit of my thinking in relation to how I've tried to approach the work, honoring and respecting research and best practices, but also attending to the ongoing work and initiatives that have been put in place that even led to this sort of isolation of Black student success. I want to take a minute to then share a little bit about a theory of action that's related to this first year, which is largely around some diagnostic work, in my opinion, and just really trying to gather information in a intentional and or methodical way. So if you think of it in terms of going slow to go fast, but for sustainability's purposes, we recognize that we don't want this work to be a one and done kind of thing, and we'd like to ensure that our intentional work has lasting impact for our students. A special note for the statement here at the bottom, so I guess just something that I want to identify as somewhat of a headline to kind of walk away from is attention to the dance of change is what I call it, right? So this balance of managing a sense of urgency, recognizing that there are students in our care now whose learning has been somewhat represented as underserving their needs, or not even, maybe not even attending to them in ways to demonstrate through measures such as academic data their level of proficiencies and knowledge. So balancing that with what I'm calling rocket science, right? So the notion of tackling people's beliefs, values, behaviors that stem from institutional racism. And so calling that out in specific is where there is this, where there's this somewhat conflict at times, right? So we all can speak to the urgency of wanting children to do well and things happening in an expedited way, but we also recognize the human element in this, and that unpacking race and our own beliefs around it is somewhat of a challenge, but an attainable challenge, all right? So, not to bore you to tears, but I want to acknowledge the intentional inclusion of the 5 essential supports. So these are documented 5 structures or components that research from Tony Bright and Schneider out of the University of Chicago have identified. So everyone's pretty much familiar with taking the 5 essentials, either from a staff person, parent, even students take it in the middle school. And I think last year was piloted from like grades 4 and 5. So trying to do a direct crosswalk so that the evidence of the D65 strategic plan, as well as those indicators for the 5 E's, wanting to make sure that that's evident in terms of just how I think about the work and then try to approach it. The next one is a little more academic language too. So the theory of action that I put in place in terms of approaching this work and working collaboratively with my colleagues stems a lot from the University of Illinois Chicago's logic model, as well as my prior experiences. And so if you would indulge me in just this opportunity of learning, the LOIS model is what it's referred to. So the L stands for leadership, and what I want you to think about is what type of leadership is needed to support change initiatives, and then how do you know? How do you go about understanding that? The O stands for organization and or organizational health. So how will systems of organization be arranged to facilitate desired adult behaviors needed to sustain the change? The I is considered the leverage of instruction, teaching, and learning. This is noted to have the most direct impact on student learning outcomes. But when you think about drilling down into data and examining it, which instructional practice changes are needed to ensure students' learning needs are being met? And then the last one, obviously, is the student learning outcomes. And so what do we expect once this examination of a problem has been identified, data analyzed, and then strategy development to take place? So part of how I examined the work was to look at the different metrics within, or the different entities which make up D65. And so a lot of my work has been largely identifying and examining different entities, so leadership, classroom instruction, different organizational systems represented by the cabinet's work. And the piece that I would say is a limitation currently, this was done in conjunction with my colleague, Ms. Jari White, but a limited piece for us at this point has been student voice. We thought by shadowing children on some of our walkthroughs and just kind of experiencing their school day and us making some speculations about that was going to be enough, but after attending the Courageous Conversation Summit, we kind of came up with some other ideas on how to best bring that information to light. And part of that rationale is changes that are happening that impact children. We want to make sure, just like the involvement of parents and community, that we're attending to those things from an inclusive mindset, not from an exclusionary practice. So I just wanted to share with you this model because it'll speak a little bit to some of the particular strategies or projects that I'm currently collaborating in and or initiating. So one of the first ones in relation to thriving workforce kind of combines looking at effective leaders and collaborative teachers. So there have specifically been opportunities to collaborate with Dr. Calgatti on designing some professional principal learning with the intention of recognizing that a data-informed learning environment with a solution-oriented approach that is basically leveraged by school leaders in conjunction with their different leadership teams will lead to some sustained but not only elevated problem-solving approaches across the different layers of the school. So working in collaboration, this is largely around building capacity to do the work of examining why problems with instruction or problems with learning may be occurring so that we can drill down into some intentional strategies. And obviously we want to build capacity from a cabinet standpoint and administrative standpoint so that that work is happening at multiple layers, from cabinet to principal, principal to teacher, teacher to even classroom practice. There's also the practice of 3 focus schools that we're working in, and so those focus schools are Oakton, Dawes, and Kingsley. These were selected based on the number of African-American students that compile some of the data achievement results, but also looking at principals' readiness to elevate and uplift an instructional practice change, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But that goes back to the lowest model. And then also recognizing that in order to have a data-driven environment, which research shows is helping us to really examine and sustain changes that can impact student achievement, we wanted to make sure that the data that's provided to teachers and school leaders is user-friendly and in a visual format. So you may have even seen a recent email that we sent out around teacher-parent conferences with some data attached to it. So trying to provide some visuals in a timely fashion to really kind of get at the ability to paint the picture of what one aspect of data provides around student achievement in a school. Ambitious instruction correlates with high-quality teaching and learning, so we've spent some time examining current practices, but also participating in designing some new teacher induction professional learning, as Beatrice referenced earlier. So really trying to take some of the practice that's happening in our focus schools and in an attempt to try to handle the bandwidth, provide some sprinkles of practice changes within our new teacher corps who has recently joined the district. Some collaboration, frequent collaboration, I would say, with curriculum and instruction, because we're constantly looking at opportunities that are geared towards fostering Black student achievement, but we also want to acknowledge the work that has been put in place for consistent implementation of strong core Tier 1 instruction before we start tweaking or making speculation. So a lot of this for me has been stepping outside of my bubble of just being a principal at Dawes and knowing that environment, but looking holistically at the school, the district at large. Also to note here is Oakton's ACC program. One of the things that is somewhat a charge is really identifying and unpacking some of the strengths and opportunities that exist within this program. As one of our speakers alluded to tonight, we want to be able to highlight many of the different programs and opportunities that are within the district and make sure that those are viable options and represent the quality that all parents come to expect and desire from our district instructors, excuse me. So here is where I would say the balance of instructional practice changes combined with data analysis at both school and district levels really provides us an opportunity to identify some professional learning needs and then to be responsive for that. And so this was largely done through a walkthrough tool that incorporated Zaretta Hammond, so we're uplifting a lot of her work in relation to culturally relevant pedagogy and brain research. So that examination, including Oakton's specific strengths, are some things that are currently in development in terms of just my lens of looking at ways to help ensure that our kids are getting maximum effort at being supported and for maximum achievement. I'll talk a little bit about involved families and family and community, the alignment between those two. So in partnership with our new Director of Equity and Family and Community Engagement, we are trying to establish a framework for our parent and community partners to, one, elevate and uplift the courageous conversations about race so that we're developing kind of this common language. This is derived from some of Epstein's work around the 6 pillars of parent involvement, and we see this as an opportunity to develop some operational definitions around some of our parent and partner organizations, as also a two-way street of helping to provide some district support, but also guidance without losing the essence of it being a parent or community vehicle for participation or involvement, sorry. Lastly, the supportive environment, safe and supportive climate. So here's an area that I would say definitely there are some more additional opportunities for me to unpack, largely in relation to the early childhood program. I am spending some time trying to just really get acclimated with early childhood in D65 from a learner standpoint before making any kind of recommendations or initiative placement within that form, just because I feel like I need to know it a little better. The ODRs that are talked about and are going to be talked about later, I think that with the inclusion of new policies for discipline and dress, which are dress code, which are seeking to specifically call out race and bias as part of those processes, I think it's important to let those policies go through a process of implementation, and I plan on becoming more of a process observer and somewhat of a critical friend to just how that implementation rolls out in relation to Black students specifically. And then I mentioned before the recent issues. So last week, spent some time talking to the ABC group, the African, Black, and Caribbean Parent Group. And one of the things that came up was this notion around the supportive environment for school students of color. And so I really want to be sensitive to really understand the different leadership and organizational structures of different schools. But I think, to Sergio's point earlier, how important it is for principals and teachers and adults in environments to kind of own that process for their buildings, and I want to be respectful of that to really learn and gather some more information before starting some of that work, specifically drilling down. So here are some next steps, and pretty much what I've described for you is a intensive look at who we are as an organization and trying to identify those things that work or those things that aren't working, and then trying to then make some recommendations on some systematic or operationalized practices across the schools that can lead to not only Black student achievement, but a greater sense of student achievement and emotional development as part of a lot of what is currently landing in schools. So we'll start with some mid-year checks with principals at the focus schools. I want to be able to disaggregate some quantitative and qualitative data. As much as I'd like to say that we'd see some intensive or some major student achievement data gains, like lessons learned, for me is really recognizing and calibrating with school leaders around some of the desired outcomes that we want to see in practice. And so being able to do a check-in in the middle of the year, close to January, to just kind of see where teacher efficacy and leader efficacy lends itself to the organizational health. Again, this is research just indicating where and how change can be elevated and sustained in a forward-moving way. Really want to do some practice around or check-in with the principal POP cohort, so I gave a little bit of a description of those in the board memo. These are a practice that we elevated in the Principal's Professional Learning Series. One, because largely we want to be able to build capacity with a gradual release model. So something that we can practice safely as school administrators and cabinet leaders, but also empower principals to leverage this type of practice of joint problem solving and ownership of solutions at their SIT and school climate meetings or across their organization. I think it's also going to be helpful for us to dig in a little more with the coaching model. I refer to it as an intensive residency because Mrs. White, who works alongside me, is spending a week at each of the focus schools. Not only, so I think that the coaching lift is a little bit different than how it might be structured in other ways. And one, because we're inserting ourselves in work that's already kind of happening. And so we want to be able to then kind of test out the glows and the grows from this practice, because it's planning, it's attending grade level team meetings, and it's teaching instructors a process that has not largely been taught in a lot of our teacher prep programs. So I'm going to say, from my experience, moving student achievement in terms of closing an achievement gap is not something that is largely taught in our teacher prep programs. That is a new skill. That's a new learned muscle that we're trying to grow, and done in conjunction with the other ask for or request on a teacher's plate. We're trying to be sensitive to what that looks like, but also making sure that it's institutionalized in their practice and supported by building leaders. So we'll be doing a little bit more analysis of how to tweak that in the event that our overall plan is to try to help elevate some teacher leaders within the schools to help principals grow that work, and then move on to a new cohort of schools, as well as collaborating with the C&I team on supporting content-specific learning. We'll continue to work with, I'm continuing to work with RAD and the new department head, Kylie, there to really try to isolate race and provide school-specific data reports, because we really want to start the practice of helping people see data as a tool to help focus some other questioning and or other practice. And in order to do that, you need real strong, crisp data systems, I would call it, so that everyone can kind of easily interpret them and ask the important questions. And then lastly, I would definitely say continue collaboration with various departments, because I think that there's a number of school partners and parent groups that we currently depend on, work closely with, and I believe that as we think about relationships with students and getting to know them in different ways that may not always present themselves as opportunities within the school environment, I suspect that we might be missing some information by some of the isolation of partners in their work and then our work as educators. And so I'll be working with a couple of my colleagues to help try to formalize some of that communication feedback, so that if a partnership or community organization has a really good relationship with families and students and sees them in a different holistic way of success, I think that that's important information for teachers and schools to have in conjunction with who they are as academic beings as well. So we want to tighten up up some systems. I largely see a lot of this layer of work as setting different frameworks and structures from the cabinet and across departments, specifically looking at Black student success. So everyone here at the cabinet has a sense of ownership and responsibility to Black student success, and we want to just be able to operationalize that and codify it for some standard practices to exist across the school. So that's largely what this year feels like. It doesn't sound all that sexy, I know. But the reality is that's what I mean about that dance of change, in that we have to be able to put some things in place while also trying to slowly and incrementally shift some mindsets and build some muscle in some areas that are not innately part of practice currently in instruction, or just even in terms of curriculum or any of the different entities. Like, this is, I'm sure you all know, this is uncharted territory for us, and so doing it in a deliberate and intentional way has been, in my purview, a smart, but sometimes frustrating process. And so I share in everyone's frustrations of what we want to see happen. And I just, I'm pleased to say that I work alongside people who are committed and recognizing that we're all feeling the sense of urgency to get this done, but to not sacrifice quality for it. So that's pretty much my report.
And permit me to underscore a couple things that Dr. Green just said, because I think they're really, really important. One is that this is a collective effort of the cabinet and our principal leadership. And so it's not just one player in one silo doing one body of work. This is the body of work that we are focused on. And what LaTarsha is putting on the table, and perhaps not sexy, but it's actually really important to your points about attainable change and not being one and done. We're working, you're working, but we're working at multiple levels, at the senior cabinet level of the district, with our principals and their own professional learning, in schools, the three schools where we're going to be able to scoop up a lot of lessons learned and a lot of ahas and a lot of oh-nos, and how do we put all that together, and in classrooms, and really observing that. So the multiple layers of the system is part of the journey here. The second one is that this is a systemic process, and that again, I think all of us who've worked in education for many, many years, I've worked for over 3 decades, we see initiatives come, we see them go. We see the wind blow one way, and then nothing happens going forward. Unless there's a systemic approach, and the systemic approach is around how do we develop the capacities of the people in our schools and at our senior levels to drive forward a change initiative. And so with the flag of urgency, it's building the systems so that we can sustain this work over time, again, so it won't be one and done. And the third thing is that this is a research-based piece. LaTarsha is quoting seminal research in the field of education, and a lot of people criticize education. Nobody criticizes Toni Bright and the 5 Essentials. Nobody criticizes Joyce Epstein and the work that she's done on community engagement. I mean, there's a body of knowledge that really drives the work that we're doing, and to be research-based and then to drive that work through the multiple parts of our system is really important. So we know that this is a snapshot right now. We know that we've got work to do, and we're going to continue to do it. And I'll finally say it's the we. We will continue to do this work together with Dr. Green's leadership.
Thank you. Let's open it up to the board for questions and comments.
I had a couple of questions. Thank you for the presentation. Can you talk a little bit more about what processes you're teaching and coaching on?
Sure. So specifically in the focus schools, what we're trying to really elevate is a collaborative data analysis process. So this is done from a formative assessment lens, and it's not tests or quiz. It's basically the practice that a teacher would use to identify students' strengths, misconceptions, and utilizing that information in a real-time fashion to make some adaptive instruction changes. And so again, it doesn't sound like something that would be unheard of, but to do it in a systematic way where it's not just because one teacher does this and does it well, but to really try to streamline and fine-tune the systems with the existing structures of instruction is what we're really aiming to. And so this kind of crosses content and things of that nature. It's just an approach of really trying to differentiate instruction according to students' needs, but to do it in such a way that it's an informed choice. And so helping teachers identify what those tools are that they can reference, how they then would monitor and track that, how they share that information with students and with parents. So we're really trying to systematize that practice, because I have experience with it working, but I also know that each context is uniquely different, and I want to be able to absorb people's strengths while also pushing some of their practice in a change-oriented way.
And I was also curious to hear more about the things that you have witnessed are working and some of the things that are not working. Specifically, you were calling out supportive environments, and I think, given the conversation we were having earlier, I'd love to hear more about what we see working and not working, and how that's a part of your larger goals.
That's one of the reasons why the logic model has been helpful for me in terms of helping to frame what systems of an organization may be. So before assessing a judgment, I need to be able to determine the type of change that an organization can manage or even initiate. And so any of the things that make up an organization, from the school schedule to a teacher evaluation process. So I'm not in a place to assess kind of where each individual environment is, but I'm looking at those particular areas in order to bring a whole picture to play, because we do know through research kind of what are those things that are high leverage leading indicators for success. And so what I and my colleagues are trying to do is really try to adapt some of our walkthrough tools and calibrate as a team so that we're then able to have that conversation inclusive with school principals, because us identifying things won't sustain the work if it's done in isolation from the school leader, who has to then be able to manage it, monitor it, push it, or pull it back. And so we want to be sensitive to that. But anything in relation to the systems of how people collaborate or not, anything in relation to how data processes are used, all the way down to how professional learning is sustained from district PD all the way to school-based PD. So there's a number of different entities that we'll be examining, and I'm hoping to have somewhat of an update of that in the spring, because we want to be able to somewhat isolate it in ways or streamline it so that it's not this mass of systems.
Yeah, so I think you highlighted what my next comment or / question was going to be, which is how are we measuring the growth, right? If we aren't starting with an idea of what's working, not working, and we're measuring changes in practice as opposed to looking at specific outcome metrics, then we need to know.
It's definitely a balance, I would say, because I do think that there is information provided from kind of those one-and-done summative assessments that leads us from a backward standpoint all the way back down into the classroom, into the instruction, into the lesson plan, et cetera. And so to never to minimize one or the other, I think it's important to recognize that that objective measure is somewhat subjective depending on the time and day it's taken and things of that nature. But it also is an on-ramp onto our kids' high school experience. And so what I don't want to do is either or, but a both and, because I do realize that by elevating race and equity learning, we are opening up an additional side of development that we also need to monitor and be attentive to. And I think a lot of our work with SEAL and social emotional learning and things of that nature definitely plays its part. It's one of the reasons why I want to be thoughtful about how our partners, so while we're changing hearts and minds, as my colleague says, there are some people who have some great relationships with our kids and know some things that we can capitalize on. So that's another example of while we're doing this slow, what sometimes feels like slow churn towards change, other small pockets or satellites are happening in an effective way, and how we're able to monitor that comes from some very systematic things that we need to do, and that's why I'm more a fan of frameworks, not taking the ownership away from any of our groups, but I think that if we can adopt some unified language and frameworks, it allows us to be thought partners as well as resources to help kind of spread that, because then it becomes a communication issue.
Well, and just to underscore again what you just said, it's not an either or, it's an and. So it's about building relationships. It's about reflecting on what's working, what's not working. It's also about knowing that the on-ramp for success at the high school is scoring above the 40th percentile on the standardized tests that we have. So we want to do all of the above and not lose sight of those on-ramps as well.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Candace?
Kind of building on that, just wondering whether you, in
Can
your
you talk
work-
into your microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry, I turned it away, so sorry about that. Thank you, Dr. Green, first of all, and it's wonderful to have you leading, guiding, and kind of shepherding this work from the outset. I wanted to say that. And then I was thinking this is a very, too broad of a question, but it is very much what you were just talking about. Have you thought about, to you, what Black student success means? Like, what are the dimensions of it? And if we were trying to, have everyone that comes into contact with a child understand those dimensions, how would we articulate it? Because we've talked a lot about the various components, and from an accountability standpoint, do you look at this or that? But I feel like if we had a picture that we were all sharing of what this means to us, and it can be, a child feels this, or what have you thought about so far with respect to that?
So thank you, Candace, for that question, and thank you for your kind words. This was something that I shared with the ABC group on Thursday, so I'm going to answer it in somewhat of a symbolic way. So we have on our district website the page of equity versus, the picture image of equity versus equality, and it's the kids standing on the boxes and that kind of thing. And so I've recently, coming from the summit, saw one that then showed a picture of reality, right? And so some child is somewhat foot in the dirt, and others are at different places as well. And then at the end of that image, it shows liberation, right? So the fence is gone. So for me, I think if I had to symbolically describe Black student success, it would be us getting to liberation. Because I think that the somewhat unfair burden caused by racism or just discrimination or implicit bias represents that fence in a lot of ways for many of our children. And if we work hard as an organization to remove that fence through our systems changes, through systematically and intentionally examining ourselves, I think that we would see Black student success through the same lenses that we look for all children to be successful. I think we do a disservice if we don't acknowledge that there have been obstacles of no fault of, any child's that they currently face. And so for me, I think that's how I best could describe it, is because I see myself as an instructional leader, right? And so I'm interested in developing the critical thinking skills that kids need to be productive citizens and make choices for themselves, not me dictating what those are. But if so much comes in the way of your learning down to, I don't even feel valued and accepted in a classroom space where I'm learning at, or any of those horrible things that we've been kind of, informed about, and some of us know well, that kind of makes liberation feel like a very far off notion and concept. And so that's why I think this work is so very important. There isn't a magic recipe for it. It's just providing people the opportunity that some get, just off of privilege or just off of a known expectation. And so that's how I would describe it. I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on that, but.
Thank you. Thank you. I hate to go to my next question from that because it's rather
kind of like a
pedantic.
powerful-
Yeah. But thank you.
And thank you for the question, because, we're taking notes, and that's going to actually drive our next set of iterations as we're doing work that's focused on Black student success, but is also focused on the robust, high-quality teaching and learning that we want to do across the system, that we are doing across the system, and we want to do even more of.
So I guess this question is more, because we talked a lot about you had talked about the coaching, and I was wondering whether that is coaching only with Tier 1 or in the general classroom setting. I mean, from a lot of the other reports that we have in the document, specifically, the school report card, we look at intersectionality between special services and race, and some of our challenges with the data related to students with IEPs. I think of that. I think of the interventions that we do in the not in Tier 1 environment. Obviously, we have to focus in Tier 1, but I'm wondering where those coaching with those educators comes in and/or those interventions, especially around literacy, like reading recovery, or how are we looking at that practice to understand what's going there?
So that happens a lot in collaboration with the C&I team in terms of us just, myself and Jari, trying to really understand broadly from the district's perspective of how those resources are being leveraged and or monitored for effectiveness. So I think that we're all kind of doing that examination of the implementation of curriculum core 1 instruction, Tier 1 instruction, and then the effectiveness of the different interventions. Like that part is unilaterally the same. I think what this coaching brings into perspective is around different practices that aren't content specific, but can just be part of a teacher's toolkit for examining students as learners, their abilities, their knowledge, and as well as their preferences, so their styles, et cetera, right? And so helping teachers become skillful at examining that information as part of building relationships with students or just their knowledge of students, using that as a planning tool. So that in that regard, that might not necessarily plan what you teach, but it might plan it might inform how you teach something or what opportunities you give children to share their strengths in ways that are more feasible for their preferences and abilities. So it's really something to be used in conjunction with, so it's just a different skill set around instruction. It isn't content specific or anything like that. And so, I don't know.
With the teachers that you're coaching in the 3 target schools, would that include teachers who are also, they're not classroom, they're not general ed classroom, but they're reading specialists or they're special ed teachers who work with students? I was just, in terms of the scope of the teachers that would be.
Yeah, well, currently in the focus schools, the teachers are selected by the principal as part of what I like to call the Army of the Willing, because specifically we're looking at helping teachers, teacher leader opportunities to kind of help lead some of the learning that happens from the front line. So that piece is unique in the sense that these are instructors from a multitude of areas that principals identified as like this person has some good practices or has some teacher leader capacity or interest. And so we want to be able to then build that capacity to help lead some of the learning in the school environment. We did not specifically at this juncture look to target any particular existing program or whatever, but I think that's where the importance of the collaboration with the C&I team comes in, because we're sharing the outcomes of what this practice looks like with other coaches and other department directors to ensure that this isn't just one aspect. Like eventually we want this to be part of everyone's toolkit. We're just kind of minimizing it for bandwidth per reason. Basically, it's me and Jari.
So, thank you. Thanks.
So I want to thank you for your presentation. I also want to thank you for, throwing the first salvo in regards to engaging parents as part of the administration in regards to, what parents should ask during a parent-teacher conference. And I got to tell you that having been an educator and as a parent myself, of Latino students, and again, I've worked in some rough neighborhoods. But again, all parents want information. 99.9% of parents want their children to be better, or have a better life than they did. But many of us don't know how to or what to ask. Or we don't have the language to ask it. So I really appreciated that. I really appreciate that reaching out to the community and saying, look, here are the numbers, and this is what's going on. And here's what, as a parent, as an adult, as the adults here in this room who make decisions for our children, here's what we can ask and how we can start having this conversation. So I appreciate it, and I would appreciate seeing more of that in regards to how we communicate with families by giving them actionable information to act upon, right, and to be proactive to work with their children around academics, around racism. Again, because we need guidance, right? The children don't come with a handbook on how to raise them, right? But there's best practices, there's research, there's brain development research that really shows, what are some things that we can do, right? So I really appreciate that. One of the things I would like you and the administration to think about is, Raj Chetty out of Harvard, along with other Harvard colleagues, released the Opportunity Atlas. So this is a really incredible use of big data, right? So they've used census data and all these great pieces of data to isolate, again, and this is moving us beyond the achievement gap and looking at the opportunity gap, which I think is the real conversation that we need to have. And they're showing that children who live in a good neighborhood, right, it's rocket science, and there's certain factors in those neighborhoods, actually, it will help determine where they end up as adults, right? So moving beyond test scores, right? It talks about early childhood, for instance. In early childhood, some studies kind of try to discredit early childhood as children do pretty well in early childhood in regards to developing their social, emotional, as well as physical and fine motor development and academic development. But then those benefits crash out, and particularly for marginalized families and students around second or third grade, right? But for me, somebody who again totally believes in early childhood and its impact, again, it's because we pull some of those elements in regards to social emotional development and fine motor and physical development, and that's where our kids crash. But the researchers, so Raj Chetty and the other Harvard researchers in doing the Opportunity Atlas map, looked at those same studies. There was one study called the Tennessee Star Study that tracked kids who were in high quality pre-K and kindergarten programs, and kids were alternately, again, there was a control group that did the STAR program, and other kids kind of just went to regular general ed class, and they specifically traced marginalized families. So again, what the initial research found that quality early childhood doesn't really work, it pans out. These guys went ahead and did the long view, and like you're suggesting, again, it's moving. We're trying to move fast by moving slow. So they took the same research and projected out the adult outcomes for these same kids who had crashed out, and they found that they were able to get higher paying jobs. They were able to, less of them were incarcerated. There were less teenage pregnancies. Again, all of these issues that again impact us because of institutional and systematic issues that have been impacting our communities for some time. So again, they've been able to track some of these really great practices that at first we're being told, they don't work, but really taking that long view. So now that Opportunity Atlas, so as we look at decisions around curriculum instruction, as you look at the focus schools, I would recommend that you look at, okay, so if you're working at Dawes, they say that within a mile where I live, there might be a kid like half a mile away that, even though we're around the same general neighborhood, my kids might have lower outcomes than this other family's kids. So really trying to look at that as a way to kind of help frame what opportunity looks like for kids. So I mean, that is my suggestion, to maybe utilize some of this big data to kind of help us give a frame of how our neighborhoods help determine the way we children's outcomes occur.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. I saw some of that work from last week, and it's really quite powerful. And you can tap into the communities and see what the dynamics are.
And then, it also kind of, and I think about, our joint 202 and 65 work and with Northwestern around the NERA project, around, again, collecting, just going beyond standardized test scores and looking at chronic absenteeism, looking at all of these elements that impact the way children, are showing up to school. And I think that's, again, all of it is complementary. Like we're really living in an exciting time with these incredible tools that are popping up that we need to, again, utilize and leverage in order to, again, resolve some of these age-old issues around, racial inequality and outcomes in the United States.
Thank you.
I was also going to mention early childhood, but Sariel offered a much broader perspective than I was going to, so thank you. Richard Rothstein's data also implies that early childhood experiences are incredibly important, and so I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about how you will learn about what we're offering in terms of early childhood and how that compares to other opportunities that are available and how that might be impacting the opportunity gap that's affecting achievement.
Well, currently, this year I attend the Early Childhood Directors Council, so I'm able to try to get a larger scope of what early childhood education looks like in Evanston. And so from there, I plan to spend a little more time digging into some of the assessment structures. A lot of my conversations with Ms. Sprague to really understand some of the work that she's lifting this year with her staff and how she's kind of diagnosing certain things is also pretty important. I should have a better idea of how that work is shaping up after a few more of those meetings, simply because I had a pre-K program before, but I'm not really sure what all of the systems that go into place in terms of like registration, child placement, things of that nature, even transition. And so last year at Dawes, I know my kindergarten teachers were thrilled to receive the, I want to call it SCIF, the SCIF report. At that particular time, it was just being rolled out. We didn't have a lot of information on a lot of students, and I know this year when they received it, there was more. So that was kind of exciting because anything that helps ease the transition for students and families ultimately, provides a win for teachers to kind of hit the ground running and build relationships with kids. And so really looking into digging into that work, but I want to be able to ask the right questions around it as well.
And I have a long list of things, so I want to give other people an opportunity to chime in. I wanted to hear a little more about the framework that you all were thinking on in terms of involved families. And also speak to something that has come up before, but I don't know if it's come up in your empathetic interviewing. Folks feeling like being bombarded with information about the gap in opportunity to achieve. In some ways, is systematically reinforcing racist beliefs, and how we be thoughtful about how we describe the opportunity gap so that it's not placing blame on individuals. And so I appreciate your thoughtfulness about that tonight, and I would just encourage that as we communicate with the community about how they can advocate for themselves, questions to ask, how to interpret the data, that we remind folks that this is not an accusation, of individuals, that this is an opportunity for our institution to do better.
I agree. It's interesting because I do think that is something that we talked about, I guess the downside of the transparency of certain data, because it somewhat validates to a certain extent or raises a concern around the picture that is painted, especially if it's done in isolation and not without a narrative associated with it. There was something else I was going to say and it slipped my mind. But it's one of those reasons why we want to be very thoughtful about the picture that's painted. And it's not to assume blame anywhere. What I wanted to say is I think that's why I wanted to preface it by the particular skill set on moving student achievement is something that does not really come out of a teacher prep program. And it's not really something that it's just common practice. Like it's a very different set that has to be developed, and some teachers who have been doing it for years have just done it and they don't need a label for it, and then others, it appears to be a different skill set, or especially if there's a mindset around where the place of interventions and things like that kind of fit. So our ask and our challenge is just to kind of clear up some of the cobwebs from that and make it very explicit, kind of everyone's role and work within supporting students, so that it's not a bombardment or overlap of supports or things of that nature. But I know exactly what you mean in terms of even with the parent guidance document. I specifically was concerned about adding a visual to that because some people were, why equity? Why do we have to do this now? Principals were also having to answer that question. And I think that I could have just shown black versus white student data, but by isolating race specifically to see the vast majority of differences that occur from children who sit in the same classroom under the same instruction, and just how learning is either received or delivered to them is a question that anyone who looks at data would kind of say like, wonder what's going on there. And so for me, that's the exciting part of this work, right? Is that no one is professed or even poised to give a specific answer, but I think that what it stirs in you in terms of what questions you ask is a powerful push for all of us. With the ABC parents the other day, had a mindset on some things that I wanted to do, but having talked to them and hearing some of their pain and concerns and frustrations, knew that it wasn't about that. It was much more about the relational aspect of the work, because that is part of this too. It's not just, here's what we're doing or here's what this is, but more so really trying to understand and work in tandem for the different supports. So going back to the statement about the framework, that was one of the reasons why we wanted something somewhat standardized, because we want all of our parent groups to understand within their operational definitions of purpose, aims, and objectives to be able to elevate race. So, or to, have that courageous conversation through the protocol. Recognizing that the communication loop, either to district, to different groups, is an area that we want to strengthen and definitely leverage for our benefit of input as well as outreach. And so there's a lot of just systematic things that if we're able to have those quick wins and close gaps, we absolutely want to be able to do that along this other longer journey. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, so my comment, I don't know exactly where it fits in to this discussion, but I also know it's something that when we are talking about Black student success in our district, we have to talk about, and that is the fact that there is a significant portion of our Black students who are bussed out of their communities to go to various schools. And we know from what we've seen most recently, but what we've known has been going on in our schools, that a lot of the supportive environments, the safety, the emotional safety that students feel is different at schools when Black students are bused into those schools. And I don't know where we fit that into this conversation. I don't know if it's, if we can add into, at this point, I don't know if it's too late to add a focus school in, but to think about one of our north side schools being, and I know Kingsley is, but one of the other schools where we know that we have some considerable concerns around supportive environments for our Black students. I would love for us to somehow see, in my years on the board, I know we've talked a lot about busing and the attendant issues that might come up with that, but I've never really seen us try to really kind of quantify and analyze what that looks like in terms of student success. And I don't know if that's something that we can start thinking about how we would do that. And I don't know if, I don't know if there's the response to that right now, but it's just something that, to me, seems to be missing from the conversation.
I know that is part of a broader conversation that the cabinet has had in the past, and also will be doing some examination of various things. From my particular lens, I think that's one of the areas where, when I mentioned earlier, kind of what was absent for me was the student voice piece. I would love to be able to create a space where I'm getting that kind of anecdotal information from kids, simply because I do think that well-intended supports and interventions sometimes fail because we lack the actual voice of those who are most impacted by them. And so for me, and I guess, the part that I'm most curious about and hopefully can contribute to is some sort of opportunity to bring that voice into the conversation as well, because I know that it's a larger issue pertaining to a lot of different things, right? And so I wouldn't begin to say that it's anything that's like on my radar from a student achievement or student success aspect as of this point, but because I don't know all of those parameters either, but I do think that it would be interesting to know how kids feel. And I've unfortunately had to hear some of the negatives and the downsides about that. But I also was a part of a conversation, to say that if parents are experiencing or students are feeling that isolation, it brought the other question to me of, Oakton's viability as an option for parents who don't want kids to feel that same sense of isolation. So again, it raises so many questions for me, more so than me having an answer or a recommendation at this point, but one that I know that we'll be exploring further.
Yeah, and I appreciate the question, because it actually pushes us to think even more so about the work that LaTarsha's leading, that we're all doing. I think the one missing element from the presentation is that LaTarsha and Jerry have been out at each of the schools and have engaged across the district. So so as we think about the question you're putting on the table, Suni, the work that's being done is not exclusively at the three schools, but it's deep at the three schools. And then how do we actually think about what, applying the research-based framework, applying the data-driven piece, and trying to understand through, as LaTarsha says, the voice of students, some of the real experiences in our other schools. So we can make that an alive question. And again, how we move forward on this and how we do this in a way that doesn't one of my concerns is, wow, we have this, let's go overload one person with a lot of things. That's not what you were asking, but we've been systematic about being careful while being urgent.
No, and I appreciate that. And I do want to, echo the thanks that other board members have said. It's exciting to see this report. It's exciting to see us deeply think about and prioritize Black student success, when we know for years that has been, our data has shown us that we're not serving that population as well as we can. And so it's exciting for me to see that we're on our way, and I really appreciate the kind of snapshot that you're giving us here. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
I don't have a question, I just have a quick comment. again to thank you. Thank you for attending the ABC parent meeting, and I want to also thank our ABC parent organizers who are in the audience. It was one of the highest attended community parent meetings that I've been to in my capacity here as a board member, and I just want to say that speaks to the parents' desire to want to be partners, and it, for me, it was just great to see you there and your acknowledgement in making us partners. So thank you for that. Also, one of the things that didn't stand out in this presentation, as it did stand out for me at the your presentation, is your notion of going into this work with sustainability on your mind. And I just want to let you know that I really appreciate that. And, you know, for those of you that weren't there, she talked about it in terms of when she's not going to be here. You know, she wants to leave this work ingrained into our school district, and I think that speaks a lot to just your collaborative nature and really your vision for the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for saying that at the meeting, because it really is important. This isn't just your work. It is the work of everybody in the cabinet and our work, but ultimately it's something that needs to be sustainable long-term beyond any of us being here. So I just wanted to say thank you to you for that.
That's after the decade or two that Dr. Green spends doing this work. Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just had a couple more questions. One, I think I'm really looking forward to hearing back in the spring, and I would love it if we could also hear from some teachers about how this coaching affected their personal practice and the growth that we will see in terms of relationships and outcomes. And I also wanted to hear a little bit more. I'm guessing our two most marginalized populations are Black and brown populations. And so I'm imagining that there is some overlap in terms of what is noticed in terms of how children are impacted in terms of lack of access to learning or attainment of the achievement that they have the aptitude to attain. And so I'm wondering if there's any collaborative work happening with perhaps our bilingual department in thinking about where there is overlap and similar experiences so that our institution can learn.
Yep. Well, I definitely think there's been opportunities for us to collaborate from the curriculum and instruction team. So we attend those meetings in conjunction. The other part of it is two of the teachers that are being coached are TWE teachers. And so that's what I mean in terms of an intentional focus on a practice that kind of supersedes any particular constraint, if you will, in terms of programmatically. Like, this is a skill set that we just want to determine its effectiveness in our current structure of initiatives, right? And so I think that those two kind of stand out as opportunities for, one, some thought partnering on a higher scale in terms of just practices and systems. I know for a fact that the bilingual directors are largely, and coach, are largely impacted by state mandates associated with the access test and things of that nature. So a large portion of their work probably goes to that. And fortunately and or unfortunately, Jari and I aren't currently constricted by anything like that. We're kind of paving a path that, again, can be replicable across contents, schools, et cetera. And so I'm looking forward to what that actually looks like, but I want to be realistic about what the capacity for doing that work is in conjunction with what the state mandate is. I mean, I think there's usually an audit every year of a bilingual or ESL program within a district. And so I don't want to set unrealistic expectations, but if we're able to build, and Paul really pushes me on the scalability of things. So this isn't a one and done kind of thing. It's not a magic sauce that Jari and I have or anything. I mean, it's done a lot with learning and listening to what's already in place and taking our experiences and helping to try to create a D65 way for it. So it's not about, replicating our other environments. It's not about changing what's in place without clearly understanding the work and respecting the work that has been done to get us to this point. So the collaboration opportunities are there. How feasible they look like, we just want to be sensitive to the reality of it.
Thank you. To you, Anjari.
I'm sorry.
I said thank you to you, Anjari.
And while we recognize that Mrs. Jari White is out in the back there, you can just wave and say hello.
I was going to do
for all
that.
the-
I
Oh,
thought
sorry.
you would kill me.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr.
very
Green. We really appreciate the presentation. And then we will move on to our final discussion topic tonight, the 2017-18 Discipline Report. I don't know if we have a change in presentation overhead to...
Well, the second one's we changed. We do want to recognize that this work was completed by our Research Accountability and Data Department. Kylie Klein, who has just landed here, did negotiate. The way she was able to land early was to also have these couple days off, so for some personal reasons. So she's not here tonight, but she's here in spirit and actually produced, she and her team produced a lot of work, and I believe Kel Gowdy and Joyce Bartz are going to focus on this presentation.
All right, good evening, everyone. I will highlight a few of the important elements in the presentation about the annual discipline report. First and foremost, want to underscore the importance that we have put forward in terms of interpreting our data through an equity lens. Our board policy really calls for this in terms of looking at the data and thinking about the way in which data has been used to perpetuate inequality and to justify outcomes that should be unacceptable in a system committed to equity. This reality is present even as District 65 seeks to use data to inform equitable decision-making. But also underscore that when aggregate data shows that members of a particular demographic group score below benchmarks or are overrepresented in data such as our discipline data, these outcomes reflect a failure of the education and social systems. These results should not be used to draw conclusions about the efforts or abilities of these students. And I really want to underscore and really take that to heart, that even looking at this data, while we have the data represents 7,940 students last year, and we 115 students represented the data, we do recognize there's still a gross overrepresentation of our Black students represented in the data. That should not be the case. And that is something we are concerned, and I was part of some focus groups last week, along with Joyce and some of my colleagues on the cabinet, Joaquin as well, and members of our leadership team, to really think about how we change the trajectory for our students and make this a different place for our students. So going forward, our out-of-school suspensions, last year we had a decrease in the amount of lost instruction due to the number of suspension days. Technically, in terms of 267 days to 244 days. We also had a slight decrease in the number of suspension incidents, 147 to 142. And then the number of students suspended, so how many students were suspended in 2017 was 127, and then the year ending in 2018 was 115. Looking across our schools, we see that there's an overall decline in the suspension incidents, the number of students suspended and the number of days suspended. We did see that there was an increase in one or two of our schools where that number went from 0 to 13, and in the 2016 school year, there were 14 incidents for that same school. We also see a change in the average number of days per incident for some types of incidents, and the total days per incident. For example, the average was in 2017 1.81, and we saw a drop to 1.72. As I mentioned in my opening statements about the number of, when we disaggregate our data by students, We recognize that we continue to have we had an increase in the proportion of suspension incidents involving our Black students when compared to the prior year. 55% to 64%, an increase in the number of suspensions involving incidents involving students with IEPs. That was compared from the year before, from 59 to 65. This is, again, as I mentioned in my opening, we are aware, we've been analyzing and thinking about what is the root of these. We see some comparative data in terms of our IEP students, similarity in terms of the overrepresentation or representation of Black students with IEPs who are also Black. And so we recognize that there's some intersectionality in that data around the number of those students and how that comes up.
I think the other thing that we want to be cognizant of is that students who have IEPs also have behavior intervention plans. And what we want to make sure that when a student has some difficulty, that is triggering a look at those behavior intervention plans to provide support that students may need when they're struggling. So, you know, that's a piece that we are really concentrating on in looking at the policy that we're working on together in terms of highlighting that piece.
So now we can look at the number of out-of-school suspensions with a specific lens towards what the incidents were and as we report them in our current coding system. And you can see here we have our standard categories, and within that you can see that in some areas there's pretty much consistency around the numbers, but there are some areas where there was a decrease, for example, in alcohol or drug-related incidents compared to the year before. We had, to last year, we had 6 to 2, and then that was a decrease, for example, and then we had an increase, for example, in theft and vandalism from 8 to 13 in 2018. And then we also had a decrease in the physical violence incidents from 42 to 37 from 2017 to 2018. I would also underscore the category of disrespect of school authority, because that was brought up at the recent board meeting. And so when this data was compiled, I actually did some work to begin to look back at it a little bit. And one of the things I found was that in the reports when we received, and the board has requested some copies of those on a regular basis, so we're working on planning to give those to the board. But you will see that a disrespect to school authority was not simply an isolated. In our mind, we may say, oh, you know, that was not a simple action of, you know, I'm upset at you, and so now you've disrespected school authority and I'm suspending you. That coding was actually linked to a couple things, and what was lifted was just the first coding of disrespect to school authority when there was a lot of complexity around what was involved. So in a number of these cases, I called principals and I've reached out to just clarify what those cases were, and they unpacked them as very complex situations, not simply disrespect. It was disrespect in terms of not following the direction as it relates to safety. So the child swung an adult. There's a whole litany of complex, it was a very layered case, I guess I would say that with, I want to be careful in revealing any details there, but simply put, disrespect to school authority in the majority of the situations where I looked into it was linked to other coded, so there was violence typically, or there was trying to, an unsafe behavior by the student, versus something like, you know, I'm upset at you and I cursed you out and now you're suspended. So it wasn't disrespect in that frame. And so I think this goes again to one of the policy questions that came up last time at our policy meeting, that we need to have better definitions about how that's being coded. And also Kylie, our new Director for Research and Accountability, if she was here, she would say that we actually have work to be done to also improve the way in which we talked about racialized language in terms of our coding. We have work to do to improve the way in which we're coding all of our work from how people are reporting the data, so it's a lot cleaner. In 2009, our district developed the Alternative to Suspension program, and so really with the priority of focusing on a homeschool connection and making sure that it provided an alternative, so students were reducing the amount of out-of-school lost time or any of the exclusionary practices. And so one of the I think this has been an important tool that our school is using, our school district has used for a while, and we've just continued to lift its importance, and basically offering counseling sessions in place or in conjunction with out-of-school suspension. And in 2018, there were 71 incidents compared to the 70 the year prior, which resulted in participation in the counseling program. So our district uses positive behavioral intervention supports as a framework to support the creation maintenance of a school climate that is most conducive to student achievement. We understand that part of that requires that our schools are lifting language in the schools that identifies what are the priorities, what are the creed of the school in order to promote positive behavior in that school. The use of data in our schools is used primarily, or I would say that the goal is to use that data primarily in terms of an ODR to develop supports, interventions in place for those students. And so in our previous reporting, we've always presented this data, but I know that we're in the process of analyzing how major or minor ODRs are linked to the types of interventions that were put in place for students versus simply the ODR data separate from that by school. However, when you isolate and you think about our suspension data and the number of suspensions we have in disproportionality of Black students, we are not surprised, and we recognize the need to now pay attention to what's coming up, lack of a better example, upstream. So starting with a minor, how are we engaging the children? How are teachers building relationships that are not an adversarial relationship through ODRs? And we can see in our ODR data that you can see if you disaggregate by race, you're seeing that it's over again a representation of Black students in terms of getting ODRs, even if it's just one ODR versus white students. There is a increase, there are some trends there. Particularly, I would say that we have an increase in the percent of white students who are getting major ODRs from the year before. Black students with major ODRs, there's also an increase as well from 23 to 26%. We do have a decrease for students with IEPs from 21 to 18%, and then for students who are classified as multiracial students from 10 to 5%. And then for our Latinx students, it stays almost the same. The slide, there is a connected report that came out, our Q1 data, that I did want to just underscore some of the trend in that so far this year, according to the report prepared for this evening, we had, as a district, 5 incidents, 5 students who were suspended, and then 11 days total for those 5 students, and representing only 2 schools this year versus last year, where at this point we had 24 days and 11 students. So we are working as we had committed to do to improve those results and not necessarily hide the data either. So.
I just have one clarification
Yes.
question. On slide 5.
Yeah, it's not correct.
100% of students at Rice have IEPs, yes?
Correct.
So in the students with IEPs, all, it says for 2018, like 91.
I think that is actually incorrect. If you look at the memo that we got, that has different numbers than what this slide
That's
has.
why I'm pointing out there's
So I think the memo, I'm assuming, is correct, but this slide, I think, is incorrect.
It reflects
Which one?
If you look at,
the students with IEPs excluding Rice line, or the students with IEPs all line, one of them is incorrect,
You're looking at table 2.
I believe. Slide 5, the second table.
if you look at table 4 in the memo,
Right.
I think those have the correct numbers, like I said. So according to the memo, the number of
65
suspects-
students versus 59 in table 4.
Right, which is not what's on this slide. Because it says 91,
Got it, yes.
so I think it's just, the
Yeah,
slide is incorrect.
Yeah, okay. And I will confirm in a crosswalk of the raw data to make sure to confirm what that is exact, to make sure that whichever is the correct number is represented
Okay.
in an addendum.
Can I make an observation while we're on that one?
Yeah.
Because it's just that, if we look at the incidents based on IEP status from 2015, not including Rice, from the memo, it's almost doubled, 40%, 27 to 52. Not the annual increase, but I'm kind of looking at the data, from the beginning of when we had the data, or at least from what we have in this presentation. And so I think when we look at that's concerning, also to the point of there is probably we don't see here the intersectionality, but again, it would be good to see that. But the number of incidents overall is trending back down, except for, if you look above at that same, at the table, except for Black students, that's a concern as well, that it had gone down and the trend is back up. And then specifically the trend for IEP students. So if you look over the 5 years, it looks like there's only been like a 3% increase in number of days, but the number of incidences have increased over that 4 years, sorry, not 5. And so I feel like that's something, while we can look at the annual data, looking at the 4-year data, and maybe we should be going back further. We have ODR data that goes back further, but I'm not sure if there's a particular reason we're going to 2015 to 2018 and then 2012 to 2018. But I just wanted to put a spotlight on, I extended my comment, but what really was designed to say the IEP data is concerning over the 4 years. I know we saw a big bump last year, and we're working on that. And specifically what we might, to Joyce's point earlier, how do we know that we aren't providing, or we aren't giving punishment or ODRs or suspensions that relate to disability? I find that a really challenging concept. Like, how do you know, and how do we know in each of these instances that there isn't a connection between the disability and the behavior, and then therefore an exclusionary kind of punishment? I can imagine that's challenging to figure out, but it's something that we've got to, how do you do that? And
Well, students with IEPs can be suspended and can get office discipline referrals. It's where we want to be very careful is how much they have been excluded from school or from an opportunity. But that part is, that protection is provided to them were they to be suspended over a certain amount of time. That would trigger a meeting where we would take a look at that.
But isn't the protection also that the suspension or the disciplinary action cannot be related to their stemming from the disability, or I don't understand the law in that way?
Well, it could be related to the disability as to why a student was suspended, but we're very careful, according to the law, in terms of taking a look at that and how long or often you would suspend somebody. It triggers or it should trigger in every school a discussion about what's going on with the child. What are the services that we're providing? Are we providing the supports that we need to do? So that's, an important piece, that just like the office discipline referrals, it's related to the interventions that then occur for that student to make sure that we're providing them the proper supports. So they are connected.
So if there's a trigger based on frequency, what is that duration and/or frequency as it relates to students?
For a student with an IEP, you might have an IEP meeting, you're going to review. If a student gets to a certain point in terms of over 10 days of suspensions during the course of the year, the IEP team would meet, and they have something called a manifestation determination meeting where they're taking a look at whether the disability is impacting the suspensions and whether we need to take a look at a different kind of programming for that student. In terms of the ODRs, it's also figuring out, are we providing the right interventions or should we be doing something different? So one of the things that we are taking a look at, though, in this whole piece of looking at our discipline is what are the interventions that we're providing, and are they across the district the right interventions? And how do we adjust those so that we can provide additional supports to children earlier through a more proactive method of supporting them? All of the work related to restorative practices, the relationship building, that's all the keys to this work.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding, is there also a frequency trigger? So, I mean, I could get, in terms of not reaching the 10-day, is there if you're suspended more than X times? I mean, we've done a lot of work to reduce duration, and you can tell that from here. We've had only a 3% increase in duration, but incidents.
In our district, if a student is being suspended, I'd say more than a couple of times, yes, the school is on top of that and looking at that as a concern and trying to figure out whether there's a better method of planning for that child or providing services or changing around supports, IEP, more time, other kinds of things that we might want to do. So that's pretty, we're pretty careful about that here.
So I think it would be helpful to me if in some of this, the number of suspensions incidents, specifically with IEP status going forward, that we might understand the number of, I think there's a separate place where number of students, is that?
So it's representative.
So we know what we're looking at in terms of incidents per students on average, and is that increasing over time? Because it's different, we have more students, or do we have the same, a lesser number of students with higher number of incidents?
So that's what that 100, from my understanding, that's the 115 represents per student. So you would not have, that represents one student per, so in the graph, for example, you would have if we start from there are 16 students that represent the 61.5 days of out-of-school suspension versus, 16 students who made up the 18 days of incidences versus, and so at Rice, we had 11 students who accounted for the 10.5 days of incidences.
Can you tell me where you're looking, just so
So table 2.
Table 2.
in the presentation or in the memo?
The memo.
Present.
In the memo, I can tell you.
It's on slide 4. In the memo.
It's
Table 2 in the memo.
It's
In the
page,
middle column of 2018.
Page 209 in the packet. Page 209 of the packet, if you're looking at the packet, and then in the PowerPoint, I can go back. Sorry, I can just use this.
Yes, but that, 209 is the pack, table 2, but it doesn't, it's not by
out-of-school
IEP status.
Okay, so the IEP status then, in terms of, that would be then on,
I mean, it's the same.
You don't have the number of students or days by IEP status, I don't believe.
number of suspension incidents by IEP status. So
I'm just saying in the future it would be
you
helpful.
would have the average student, yes, got it.
Have the
That's
number
good.
of
Yeah.
students and number of days so that you could do the
it's
average.
not done the same way, yeah.
Yeah, it's not, you're right. Thank you.
Joey, I did kind of cut you off when I noted that the slide was incorrect on there. I didn't know if you had another question around that, or if it was just that you were asking about the accuracy of the
I
numbers.
just wanted the data to reflect accurately so that we weren't
Okay.
looking at wrong
Okay.
numbers, yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question in terms of by incidents. The way that we code, do we pick like the highest infraction and then that's how we code it? Or if there's like disrespect, physical violence, how are those coded in here? Is it,
So-
do we pick like one thing and that's the one thing that they're getting suspended for? Or is there like a combination of things that students get suspended for?
So in our current reporting, you would only get one, so if a code came in with multiple, it was one that was picked for the reporting.
For the report?
Yes.
Okay.
So you wouldn't have duplication or mudding in that way. But what I would say is that we are working, currently we've used the support of Amanda Zamudio, who works in a number of departmental areas to do that work. And so she has brought to our attention the need to tighten that reporting structure. And so once I get more clarity on that, I will be able to report on what was done to
Okay.
improve it and how that changes any of our information.
Okay, two more things. So last week, we had our community parent conversations around discipline, and I'm just curious when we'll be getting a summary of those groups, and maybe if you could just give, I don't know, a general overview of were they well attended, what kind of feedback are we getting, or maybe just when we can expect to see that information.
So we had 3 events last week. 2 of them were better attended. The first one was election evening, so we low attendance at that one. But the other 2, we had 8, and then I think there was about 5 or 6 at the second one. So in terms of feedback, in both sessions, actually, they were a little different. So in our first session, I will say that we had on Wednesday evening. Well, to answer your question, the report will come as part of, we were planning to put it as part of the policy report in January. We're going to bring that at that point. But I can highlight that we really appreciated the voice of those parents who came out at both sessions to really weigh in on the urgency and also the need for real analysis. And I would say that what came out for me personally, I'll speak, is that, and the team met this afternoon to look at the reflections and the feedback, is a couple of things. One is that really how we develop our understanding of our partnership with parents is really crucial when it comes to discipline and thinking about a restorative process, that it's going to be really important that we include in the policy work a lot of feedback about we are partners as parents. We are, you have to think about that approach and that relationship as important. So we're analyzing that, we're thinking about how to do that better. The second part that I would say is that and it put, I would argue, just the front line of people are hurting. There's a lot of pain for our families, for some of our families who are experiencing the way in which our discipline practices, particularly ODRs, are meted out. And when we see that in our data, it can be a little flat. But but to be with families who really experienced that pain was very important for us, I would say. And they gave us some important feedback about how do you make sure that this is real and is leading to some real change.
We had a lot of activities going on that night. I was driving home from training for collective bargaining for the future, and Andalip called me, and we spent a good hour on the phone because your observation of the importance of parental voice and then how poignant it was during the session. And so we'll be able to report that back in January.
Okay.
So a week and a half ago, also, Andalip and I met with some people from CASE, and they indicated to us a number of things that they urged us to put into policy, which we took a look at that and are working on implementing those pieces. CASE, the special education group. We looked at the information together with our group that's been working on the restorative practices people, some principal leadership, Joaquin, Andalip, and I today, to identify what are the areas that we still need to address in terms of the policy. So that's the input that we got both from last week and then during the summer is all pieces that we're putting into this framework.
Okay. And then finally, this has been called out already, the meaning of respect, and also the number of suspensions by school. I mean, we're seeing a lot of them at the middle school level where, for those of us that have teenagers in the house, that's a very challenging area. And I can tell you that as a parent of a teenager, there are times where we as adults can be disrespectful to kids and not respect their coming of age and just treating them in a certain manner that minimizes their ability to stand up for themselves. And I think as I look at this data and I look at the middle school data, and especially as the certain subgroups, I hope that in the conversations that we had with community and as you continue your work, that we really talk about the meaning of respect and what that means not only to educators, but what that also means to our students.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I would say that the biggest challenge that both our policy is lifting and that the Illinois policy lifts in this regard is that we're not using discipline or suspension anymore as a punishment. Suspension really needs to be the result of an issue of threat assessment and concern for safety, not a punishment for a child. And that exclusionary practice have to change. And that because we know that doesn't work. Now, I will say that part of the help we will need from everybody, particularly parents. Not all parents agree with this. For example, on the first session was polar opposite of the second session we had last week, where parents were saying, what's the line? At what point can we can we suspend? And that concern for safety of, at what point? Is it a gun? Is it a knife? What causes that person to be excluded permanently from a school? And the reality is that Illinois state law has changed where that regardless of what there is very clear parameters for when we assess, and each case will be handled in a case by case to make sure that the safety of the students is protected, the staff is protected, but also the rights of the individual child are protected. And that we know that exclusionary practices historically, due to the way in which they lead to a school to prison pipeline, do not work. And so what does that mean for our whole system? One of the decisions we made today in our policy group was to think about what are the learning needs of the adults, the parents, the school system to now respond to a change in policy. Because a simple, as we know with Illinois policy, this went into live 2015, I would say we are in the majority of schools versus, we are one of few school districts that are really looking at this in a multi-layered fashion. I think that a lot of school districts are still working on this, and I'm not saying we're far ahead, but I would say that it's requiring a big change in our thinking and education for everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I had a couple of questions. I appreciate you mentioning the lift that's happening and changing mindset. I think one of my questions is connected to Rebecca's and also something that I've asked before, which is I noticed that there was a mention in the slides of counseling can be provided to students if there's an infraction. And I'm curious if that ever includes restorative work with the adults who were included, to ensure that students are not being put back into situations where relationships have not been repaired with adults, and then adults are acting on that relationship that's not repaired and perhaps causing additional challenges with the relationship.
So, there are two, it's referring to two separate things. So one was the counseling sessions, the alternatives to suspension that was started in 2008, where we have social workers in the evening who, per 1 day of suspension, what would have been a day out of suspension, there's a counseling session with a social worker, and people sign up for those. In terms of the work with adults where a situation may have happened in the school, that was the whole concept of implementing the restorative practices facilitators that we have this year, working with Chute Haven, Nichols, and King Arts, which were the schools that we decided to pinpoint to work on this whole relationship development with both sharing circles, responsive circles, restorative conferences, et cetera. So one aspect of that might be if a student had a problem, for instance, with a teacher, the facilitator would do a restorative conference where there's an opportunity to repair the harm that may have happened within that relationship or in a situation. So that's part of the piece that we're working on right now in terms of developing that, specifically with our middle schools, because we want to impact that area.
And just to be clear, the teachers are part of that?
Yes.
They sit together, okay. Just to be
Yeah,
clear.
teachers are involved, or administrators, depending upon what the situation is that may have occurred.
That's something that's being developed. That's not something that's currently, or it is currently happening.
We're in process, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So I think, just to highlight again, if I wasn't explicit enough, that sounds wonderful. I would worry if there's undue burden put on the child to repair. Sometimes adults need to repair with children also.
Absolutely.
Or adults need to be honest when they felt hurt or triggered and in some ways contributed to the breakdown. And I think that's important for children and families to hear. Because to be frank, I think that some of our children and families feel like they're being racially profiled in our schools. And that is painful, right? And that contributes to how safe our learning environment is. And it also contributes to, if we're struggling with folks who hold racist beliefs, we have some systematic issues that are confirming some of those racist beliefs for children and adults. And we need to look at how we contribute to that and how we
I agree.
break it down.
I agree.
So I'm just curious how we have opportunities built in for repair for students and families. Because perhaps on occasion, it seems like on several occasions, we have students who are Black, brown, and with IEPs who are being involved with disciplinary infractions at an inordinate rate, and it's disproportionate to their presence in the building. Which tells me that there's a breakdown that some adults are involved in as well, not just children.
Absolutely. You know, this is something, you know, we agree with you. This is just something, though, that we started this fall. So this is very new where we are with specifically the middle schools. Yeah.
I think I would welcome and invite feedback also at the goals and of the new policy being lifted regarding discipline, because I think that is a place where we can start to move out of, I guess you could say, we want to move from being kind of putting Band-Aids on various issues as they rise, but rather look at the framework that we need to really adopt in our work forward. I would argue that there's a lot of strength in what's being lifted, but I think the real focus of a shared policy that encompasses a lot of how we approach these things is going to be paramount. So, for example, we have prioritized addressing racism as part of our policy statement around discipline, because we recognize the role of implicit bias. And that's something that we have precedent in terms of the state, but also in our own work. We've prioritized trauma, recognizing that I as an adult may be triggered by an instance, both from my own personal trauma in life, and so an incident may bring up for me as an adult feelings that are adult-like feelings, but they're not rooted in what's happening with that individual child. People quickly, in fact, last year at this very meeting, if you look at November 20th, we had a list of adults who spoke here at the podium of the harm and the upset they were feeling at Lincolnwood School regarding the way in which they wanted children removed from that school. And many parents stood here and spoke to the need to remove those children in very hurtful and I would say intense ways, because their children were hurting as victims. And so I think how we support our victims is an important part of our policy as well. Those who are harmed and then those who are harming, and how do we balance this? And so it's not a very, to say it's complex is really underrating it in some ways, because I think it's a multi-layered. And that's why I think that the opportunity of a policy that puts the vision, but then also the pillars, and then the practices, and then the learning that are required is going to be helpful as we match that with our racial equity work, and we match that with the curriculum and instructional piece that's going to come. So I think that we are beginning. I think there's a lot required, and so we have to also measure our steps and not overpromise and think, okay, here's this policy, we're going to change everything overnight, but rather understand how do we build this in a way that builds the capacity of everybody to, as in Dr. Green's presentation, the idea of sustainability in this. And so what comes first? What do we need to do? Is it about prioritizing the courageous conversations in our daily work and our daily practice for the adults and for our parents, and then for our students, understanding that this is the vision of who you need to be and who you are and what we need to do to support you. And so that's the vision for students. And we've seen in our school work plans, some of our schools analyzed the data last year, not all, I would say, but many, particularly some ones were in our middle schools. To your point, Ms. Mendoza, there were schools that did put some analysis in middle schools around the way in which they were thinking about their middle school students. So why were their incidences significantly, particularly for Black and Latinx students? And so how do we change the culture?
Thank you. Paul.
Can I ask one more question? Yeah. How do we reflect lost instructional time if it's not an exclusionary suspension? Like a child is in the office for some period of time, or because it's best to, de-escalate, but to put them have them in a different environment, but maybe that tends to take a longer period of time, more like an in-school suspension. How do we quantify that and track that? Or do we?
So that would be tracked at the school level, but it's not something that we've collected. If there is a ODR that's reported, it would be tracked in the ODR, so Swiss data would have that data.
So it would be possible for someone to have a full day in-school suspension, that you don't have access to that data?
Oh, we have access to the data, but it would be through the school in the Swiss data. Okay. You would have to have access that way.
I would just say maybe that's something that we should look at. I don't know.
Right.
I suspect that, for all the best intentions, but again, how are we taking children out of their classroom environment? The effects are similar. They're not as bad, but the effects are similar if instruction is lost. So just understanding that magnitude of lost instruction, how would we do that? And what kind of lift would that be, and all those things.
Right, that's right.
I think I would echo wanting to see the number of suspensions and this data, the IEP status, disaggregated by race, because right now, I think just looking overall, I think the disproportionality of the increase, or the increase is probably disproportionately represented by students of color just by looking at the two tables. It seems like that's a logical conclusion to make, but it would just be good to have a better understanding of that, so that when we look at the analysis, that we are making sure that we're looking at the intersection of those two, of race and disability, as we look at how we address them. I also am curious, and I know we have discussed this in years past around alternatives to suspension, but I think I can't find it right now, but I think in one of the slides you said that there were 71 incidents where alternative suspension was offered, although we had 142 incidents of suspension. So does that mean?
There were 71 incidents where families agreed to use the ATS. ATS is offered or should be offered at every incident.
Offered at every, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Unless the school felt that there was a need to not offer the ATS.
Right.
For a threat reason or threat assessment or some reason.
But we feel that ATS should always be offered no matter what the incident is, because we like to offer that as an opportunity for the student and their parent to talk about whatever had occurred. But families don't always accept the ATS.
So, and I know we've talked again in years past that when we look at students who have, and families who have been through the ATS process, that there's fewer repeat incidences. I know we've seen that data before. I don't know if if that still tracks. I would assume it still tracks currently that that's the case. So I know we had talked about at one point in a policy meeting years ago. Right now, ATS is dependent on families agreeing, and there might be a variety of reasons why a family can't agree to, a weekend even. And I know that you provide as many alternates as possible to make it accessible to families, but still it might not be. So I don't know. I know at the time we had talked about, is there something that we can offer to students that isn't necessarily dependent upon family, parent participation? Because if we're seeing that when this type of counseling is offered, that it's reducing the rates of repeat incidents, then maybe it's worth exploring if there are other opportunities.
Well, I think that's what some of the restorative practices addresses, although we have included parents in the incidents depending upon what's occurred. So yes, I think that can happen. I think social work service that might happen within the school might be without the family.
Okay. But those don't reduce the number of suspension days?
No.
Right.
No.
So I want to echo again that the call for disaggregating students with IEPs are suspended by race. And I also, so one of the more impactful Courageous Conversation presentations I went to was last year, and it talked about how, it's a great article that they shared with me around critical race analysis around how students are receiving IEP or evaluated for an IEP, and across the country, Black male students are given IEPs around EBD, or emotional behavioral disorder. So if we can break it down by that much as well, I would really like to see how, again, what those numbers look like. Because again, even in diagnosing children or giving them IEPs, there might be some implicit bias that help make that determination. So, I mean, that's one of my asks, is that we really be, try to dig in to see how even just giving kids IEPs and their emotionally behavioral disorder IEPs, how that is panning out in our school district. I also think about how, again, for other cities and school districts who worked on equity, this and states who've adopted these, these changes around suspensions and expulsions and discipline. There's been struggles, right? There's struggles, and going back to what you're saying, Dr. Kilgadi, around what, again, referencing that November 20, conversation, and probably some of the conversations you had with parents earlier this year, is that, again, there's this, you have folks who are like, when is it okay to suspend a student? You have other folks who are like, how do we support families, right? And there's this, I think about an article I read about in Minnesota, where again, they do a lot of this great equity work, but because the adults weren't supported, or there wasn't any capacity, the folks who were on the side of, well, this didn't work, because again, you're just, you're just letting everything happen, and because of equity, and then there's no discipline, then these folks are walking away saying, well, equity doesn't work. But again, we know that it didn't work, because again, the adults weren't prepared, and there was perhaps this lack of communication among all the adults, the parents and teachers in regards to training on how to deal with behavioral issues, and then training about implicit bias. So again, it's complicated. There's all these moving pieces that I think we're trying to address through school climate, through all of the different through our equity work, through equity trainings, but I just want us to be mindful that, we need to look at other places where, again, people are always trying to discredit the equity work. And we want to make sure that this is sustainable work, that this is something that we are committed to doing to benefit students, in particular students who've been marginalized for so long. And in regards to thinking about strategies, in regards to how we address suspensions, one of the things that I've asked about is looking at and maybe doing home visits. So one thing I proposed is looking at doing home visits and asking teachers, maybe giving them an extra stipend to go and home visit kids who maybe fall below the 40th percentile or 25th percentile, but also who may be exhibiting a pattern of behavioral issues. Because again, and I really appreciate you mentioning, the issues around trauma, right? Because again, what is it that's causing these behaviors for both the child and the adults? And then maybe trying to figure out a way that we can tailor supports for that student and their family. So again, I appreciate the report. And again, it looks like we still got a lot of work to do, particularly for our marginalized students. And again, looking forward to working at the policy committee, where again, I think we've had some really robust conversations on how we move forward. But again, trying to make sure that we get the policy right in order to make it sustainable and that supports the capacity of all the students and all the adults that are involved in the school district for better outcomes for our students.
I just want to echo a call for the intersection of the data, especially given the numbers for the quarterly report. I was happy to see that the incidences of suspension in this quarter and this year in comparison to the previous year are significantly down. But it was disappointing to see that all of them were Black, Latin, and IEP status student populations. And I think that there's an intersection because there was 3 students with IEPs, and I think that they were all Black, Latinx, and multiracial. So there's certainly an intersection. I think that it would be really useful to be able to see that in the numbers. I also was wondering if there was a gender element and if it's specifically boys that are being over-disciplined, and wondering how that idea of Black and brown boys being dangerous or being criminalized might be playing into these numbers. And I think that it also might be interesting. I'm wondering if you all had done any thinking without disclosing, because the numbers are so small, without disclosing any specifics, any thinking about, are there particular IEP identifications that are trending in the individuals who were disciplined or suspended in this quarterly suspension report?
Some of those students are at Rice, are residents there.
Right, I'm familiar. So was there a trend in diagnosis that is maybe
Yeah, many of those students have emotional needs.
Okay.
I want to make an observation. The good hard work that we've all been doing on this for years, for 5 years now, both board and passing policy before the state passed the law, moving forward on documenting in a transparent way so we can have the type of dialogue we're having tonight. It's actually really important, and we can try to dig deeper and deeper, but in some ways, maybe Sergio, you were saying this, of those districts that have done equity work, we're on the cutting edge in terms of really actually having a type of conversation that has the impact that we just had. A lot of this follows through as we go down the journey from 2015, 2014, 2015 to the engagement that we've done and that Joyce has led on the climate teams and really being explicit about looking at school climate
the combination of work that we've done, that Joyce and Annalise are lifting right now in building the policy based on the concerns that we have, and in harvesting and engaging and understanding and listening to parent voice. And so I just want to thank Joyce and Annalise especially on this work. It's very intense work, it's very important work, and we're shifting a mindset of the adults who work in the system, because the adults that work in the system had a tool before 2014 called suspension. And whether you were a principal or a teacher or a support staff person, you knew that you could actually use that tool and move. And the pivot, and now the state of Illinois requires this, but the pivot that we're making to actually think about what Joyce has put on the table, and it's a really important next step, which is, it's a step that we're implementing around restorative practices, especially in our big middles and King. That level of execution is really, really important to moving forward, and indeed, we want these data to change. We want we want to help young people become successful and even more successful, and so we have to work, especially, I think, Anya, you put this on the table, with the adults to be able to actually change that. But I want to recognize the really hard and intensive work that Joyce has done, that Annalise is doing. Joaquin has jumped into this as well as the rest of the colleagues, and our principal colleagues who have actually helped to lead some of this work in doing the parent engagement. It's an important journey we're on, and we have to keep going.
Thank you.
I just want to highlight, I agree with you, and I really appreciate the amount of stakeholder input that's going into this. And I hope that our line of questioning doesn't feel disapproving. I know for me, part of it is informed by also hearing those painful stories. And wanting to find and discuss what our solutions are for folks who do feel like they're suffering. And that's I think I want to clarify, that's what's behind the line of questioning, not disapproval for the work that's being done. I understand that a lot's been put into it, and it's good to see those numbers have gone down. Sense of urgency.
And it also reflects how we are applying the equity impact statement in our work, because when you ask the question, what was the stakeholder involvement, the answers have been that our colleagues have worked 3 straight nights last week over time during the summer to actually build the draft and the next stage of policy based on the voice, sometimes the painful voice, but the important voice of parents in the community. And indeed, there may be some overlap when Dr. Green continues her work and sort of thinking about the student voice. That will actually inform as well. It goes back to the earlier conversation. If you sat in the Haven auditorium last week and you watched as kids in the theater of the lunchroom stood up and talked about their own experiences and how they're struggling, it drives our work and it drives our commitment.
Just one thing, and I'll try to be as brief as possible, that I kind of feel is missing. As I was listening to Dr. Green, and then we get into the discipline report, and then Sergio said there's always critics for the equity work. I think about affinity groups and the value of them, and where on this journey does it make sense to, as a white man, it's very easy for me to decide, it's a privilege of being white to decide where the urgency lies for myself to engage in the work, right? Because it is not thrust upon me by the world. And so when is it right to engage a white affinity group in a conversation about the why? And talk about why the urgency exists for people who don't have the lived experience, who don't talk about the trauma, right? Who, for the most part, don't show up at that meeting to hear those stories, who don't engage in those conversations, but who need to be there to also be a part of the work. You know, that's something that I think has to be threaded in at some point, and I'm game for playing. But obviously, you don't just like throw that out there, but it's got to fit in there somewhere. And the other thing I was thinking about was alternatives to suspension. Don't underestimate the power of utilize your elementary schools for the big kids in a day of service. Because when they go back from whence they came, with the people that had them for 6.5 hours a day, they turn into leaders with a fresh start, even if it's for that one day. And there might be some power in that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And, you know, I think to your comment about the affinity groups, I think there is to varying degrees, that work is happening at schools. A lot of it is parent-led. Through the PTA Equity Committee, we actually started to have a discussion that we didn't get to finish, and we'll continue at our next meeting next month, around what kind of courageous conversations or what kind of work is being done at the school level with parents. So, and Joaquin was there and got to hear some of that, and hopefully we'll be able to come to the next meeting too and hear more and contribute more in terms of guidance of what can happen at schools. But I think particularly this was spurred by Mr. Weinberg's letter regarding Lincolnwood and knowing that Lincolnwood is not unique in the district and these incidents happening. And so there, in that sense, there's been an increased urgency, even from the parent community around that. So I think that hopefully we'll be able to see more of it, and hopefully as a district we'll be able to help guide those conversations and hopefully have a meeting like Anya had called for at our last meeting around what is the work as a district that we are doing to make sure that our schools are anti-racist spaces. And I think that that's part of that conversation. Mm-hmm. So hopefully we'll be able to do that soon. Thank you very much. It was a late discussion, but a good one and all necessary. So we appreciate everyone's time. We have some additional committee meetings and things on the calendar, so I'm going to assume that we don't have any specific reports. And so with no further business, I adjourn this meeting at 10:14 p.m. Thank you, everybody.